Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Conversations for the Future. I'm Lee Steinke with Foundation for the Future. It's good to see you all again on the Zoom, and I also want to welcome our live stream viewers who are about 6,000 strong each month. This month, we're talking a little bit about space investment with a variety of other topics sprinkled into the mix, including special segments What's Going On with Laura Forsick and Saturday Space with James Vaughn. Now, last month, our executive director, Tim Christman, interviewed David Logston, and they talked about NASA's soft power brand and the need for Space Force to get on that train and have logo apparel widely available. I said I'd like to have one of those t-shirts, and I was going to start working on that for Space Force. And I'm happy to report that Dr. Joel Mosier at Space Force has come through for me. And I'm donning my brand new Space Force t-shirt for you today. Now I'll do one for the screen grab. Okay. You can express your envy freely in the chat, and hopefully soon they will be selling those out in the world. All right, and without further ado, I want to bring in the Foundation's executive director, Tim Christman. He's a former CIA and Army intelligence officer who supported the National Space Council and the Joint Staff at the Pentagon. He holds master's degrees from American University in Intelligence Studies and International Relations and Affairs, and he is the author of the book Humanity in Space. He speaks and writes articles about space infrastructure development and the expansion of our civilization to space. Tim's next challenge and mission is to make space accessible, survivable, and ultimately routine enough to be boring. Tim, take it away.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lee. And yeah, that's a fantastic shirt. I now need to give Joel a hard time. And that's the problem. Once you give one away, now you're stuck.
I know.
Yeah, man, that's cool. Well, welcome to all of you in the room and beyond. It's exciting to be back another month into 2022 after what has seemed like a whirlwind 30 days. We're already, getting to the middle to the end of February, and while the weather is certainly reinforcing the time of year, definitely doesn't seem this late. I wanted to take some time today. Normally during this time block, I sort of introduce Foundation, whatever one of our new initiatives are at the time, but wanted to take some time to talk about what's happening, whether it's here in DC, out in the rest of the US with our workforce development, and then what's coming next. So I figured that that might be a nice change of pace for those of you who are here a lot and may normally use my presentation for a nap. So
Do that, Tim.
As I was saying, it's the last month has been quite busy, and not just for us here at the Foundation. I want to talk a little bit about the government and what has been happening on Capitol Hill and where we see some of that going from here. Then I'll jump into the workforce. So on the government affairs side, there's really about three numbers that matter when we're talking about the way and the way to look at what's happening in DC and a lens through which to look at what's coming. Those numbers start with the number one. I feel like I'm the count on Sesame Street. So we have 1 day left of government funding under the current continuing resolution. There is widespread expectation that another continuing resolution will be passed, giving the House and Senate about 3 weeks to finish wrapping up the funding bills for this fiscal year, which for those of you who aren't familiar with government fiscal years, started back in October. So the government's already been running for half its fiscal year on these continuing resolutions, which means everything stayed at its funding level from 2021. And a lot of the major programs that have been passed over the past 6 to 9 months, including the bipartisan infrastructure bill, haven't been funded. And so none of that money can start going out the door yet. The second number is 7. So 7% inflation is what the economy is currently running at. And regardless of whether you're in the camp of this is transitory or the sky is falling, that number has a very real impact here in DC. That inflation number in no small part derailed a lot of talks around new COVID relief money, new investments in infrastructure, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But that is something that is going to be a huge issue over the next 3 to 6 months as we see whether it goes down, continues to stay high, and ultimately, if it remains high, is going to be a ongoing source of friction and one of the main things that prevents things from getting done here. And the final number is 30. That is the number of House Democrats who have said they're going to retire before the 2022 election. Typically, every election cycle, there are a handful of members retire for various reasons, whether it's they think they can't win or they want to move on to something else. But this year, it's an unusually high number of Democrats and an unusual grouping of senior Democrats. On the Republican side, it's been 15 members who have said they're going to not run again. Most of those are junior to mid in terms of seniority. On the Democrat side, easily half of their 30 are senior subcommittee or committee chair people, and most specifically of interest to those of us in the space community. Representative DeFazio, who has led the House Transportation Committee, is retiring. He has been a long-standing skeptic of space as a transportation modality, as a viable sector. And so it'll be interesting to see as he is replaced next year, regardless of which party takes the election, how that shifts the thinking in that committee. So those are the 3 numbers. As you can see, some of those were addressed here on the slide, but I want to dig in a little bit more on the infrastructure bill and then the election. So as I mentioned, the inflation numbers have been persistently high and have been a big reason why Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema have both come out in opposition to the president's reconciliation bill, the Build Back Better bill that you may have heard in other words. And they have more or less said that it is dead. They're not going to revive it. And so while there is a small chance that the president and the Democrats may be able to negotiate a smaller version of it that brings back maybe the child tax credit or some form of investment in human infrastructure, it's highly unlikely that anything in that bill is going to be expansive enough to include investments in the space sector. We're still waiting for the NASA authorization bill to pass. It looks like it's not likely to pass again this year. And so space really has remained something that is an afterthought in this Congress as they continue to fight over the fallout from January 6th. It's been over 400 days since that occurred. And again, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, that has shifted how Congress works with itself in a very fundamental way. Before, a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the attacks were public, but didn't convert to actual private animosity. That has shifted to the point where there is a growing sense on Capitol Hill that each party is out to get the other in a very personal and visceral way. And that has significantly eroded the trust that both sides need in order to work bipartisan legislation. That's not to say there is no one on the Hill that can work together, but it has been a noticeable tone shift. And that's not just us that is hearing that. In our interactions on the Hill, I was at the Commercial Spaceflight Federation members meeting yesterday. Their lobbyist from KL Gates, Paul Stilmers, mentioned the very same thing and gave an anecdote about how one senior member of Congress was talking about how their view was that there was no point ever working with anyone who ostracized Republicans this last year, essentially saying, if you didn't stand with us during this dark time, don't ever come back to us again to ask for anything. And so that is a ill omen, if you will, for future cooperation over the next year, at least through the election, if not beyond. And so getting to the election, the failure of the bipartisan infrastructure, or the failure of the partisan infrastructure bill, that Build Back Better bill, really marked the end, or what we assess to be the end of any serious legislation coming out of DC until the election. There will continue to be bills that are passed in both the House and Senate. Some of them may be actually passed together and passed into law, but a lot of them are going to end up being messaging bills that allow members of Congress to go on the record and to say they are for something, they voted for something. And there will probably be a handful of bills that pass, not necessarily related to space. But the election is going to start eating up more and more of Congress's time and attention. And already they have less than 100 days of work. I believe it's actually under 70 days of work now between now and the election. So it's not a lot of time. They have to get funding bills from last year finished, finish funding bills for this current year. And so we expect it to be a pretty stagnant environment for any legislation, at least through the election. So a relatively dour picture I just painted about the current situation in Congress and here in DC in general. And so what we're trying to do, recognizing the fact that this is the environment we're in, is trying to address the issue that a lot of space organizations have of holding the attention of members of Congress. Very often when nonprofits and space organizations go up to Capitol Hill, they get widespread interest in what they're talking about. Many members will signal their support and be interested in helping, but then that good intention, whether it is sincere or not, gets overcome and overwhelmed by events. And so that is in part because the average member of Congress spends about 7.5 hours a day on fundraising calls. So if you can imagine that much of your day spent just raising money so you can keep your job, doesn't leave a lot of time for other things, and often would make you lose focus on whatever it was you just talked about, not related to raising money. So recognizing that fact, and that's just the world we live in, the Association for the Future has supported the launch of a Space Political Action Committee. This is a hybrid PAC. So if you've heard of super PACs, it's a similar formulation to that, but it is a political action committee meant to represent the interest of the space economy at large. It's not meant to be the sole a sole tool for us here at the foundation or the association, but instead a nonpartisan organization that can donate to both sides of the aisle and be responsive to the priorities that are set by a broad coalition of policy organizations in the space sector. And so we've already started talking to a number of organizations about creating an objective third-party score that this political action committee can use in order to gauge who in Congress should get its donations and who should have their opponents funded. And so ultimately, this will end up looking like something like how the NRA or Emily's List create scores that gauge almost like a report card, what grade politicians get in terms of their support for or against bills that favor them. And so that I think is an exciting new tool that the space sector at large now has to get politicians in a room and actually listen in order to combine those two things that Congress people do, raising money and making policy. One of the first things this political action committee is going to do is a series of fundraising dinners with members of Congress. And the idea behind this is this will give not only the PAC the ability to raise its profile with members of Congress here by hosting these events where they can raise money, but it also lets the PAC bring in voices from across industry. So these dinners will be small, 10 to 15 people who pay between $1,000 and $2,500 to come attend the dinner, talk with the member of Congress about what's going on, whether it's with their company, with issues they care about, and spend a couple hours in that personal engagement with a member of Congress so they can, that way, you know, it benefits the member on the policy side as well, so they can get a better understanding of what the rest of us are thinking and not just what their staff is feeding them. And so over the next few weeks, we'll be announcing which members of Congress are going to be participating in this dinner series, and hope to have 1 to 2 of these a month over at least the next 6 to 9 months through the election, and then hopefully beyond that, so we can continue to engage these members who are friendly to the space sector, but maybe not one of the traditional ones, not one of the ones that sits on the science and tech committees, but that sit on, maybe it's transportation, maybe it's labor, and that are interested in space and want to know more about how they can help. The final thing that we're working on over the next 30 to 60 days is starting to engage more with the House Financial Services Committee. This is a committee that governs a lot of the regulations for the finance community. And as we see that there is an increasing likelihood that the next Congress will see Republicans take over, we're trying to determine what the sentiment is on both sides of the aisle for regulating the space sector. There's been a lot of talk this last year about new regulations, be they safety or financial, related to investments in space. And we're trying to gauge where is that thought right now, especially with the potential new majority? And how can we start shaping that to ensure that these early conversations members and their staff are having are ones that are favorable to us in the industry? Turning to workforce, the Good Jobs Challenge is something that I know I've talked about quite a bit, both here at Conversations and in my weekly newsletter. But the quick summary of what it is it's a national grant program trying to help disadvantaged communities rebuild their workforces around the country. It's a national program, about 500 million in total funding. We applied and put together a proposal for about $23 million to create a national workforce development team that would, in essence, create a franchisable model for space workforce development. We would pair this with our Space Ready certification program, where this grant would pay for trainers to come in and create the framework for a space curriculum at community and technical colleges, adapting what already exists, tweaking where it needs to. We come in behind, certify the school as being space ready, and in exchange for these initial schools being funded through the grant for this training program, they have to agree to train other schools instructors. And so in essence, we create this self-reinforcing loop where I call it a Ponzi scheme for good, where the first school has to commit to training a certain number of instructors from other schools before they start training students, and the same on down the line. So that way we're able to spread this franchise out with little to no upfront cost to these community and technical colleges. What we're looking ahead for in this workforce plan. So as I mentioned, this franchise model, we're trying to determine, regardless of whether we get the grant to implement this, what does that need to look like? We have the shell of that that we submitted with the proposal, but with the grant decisions not expected until summer of 22, we have a little bit of time here to build out that plan. So instead of just waiting until the grant's decided to actually start any of the legwork, we are beginning the process now of going back to partners who agreed to help and trying to find new partners interested and determining what is it they need on day one. The same day we find out we have money that can be turned on, what is it you're going to need? When are you going to need it? What can we start now? What are those, concept plans and documents that can start being worked on now? We're also working on designing a industry-wide workforce development survey. Yesterday, I was talking with the director of the White House's Space Commerce team at the National Space Council. And she was mentioning that that is something that the White House recognizes is a huge gap in information, that they just don't know what needs there are for workers, what companies are doing about filling the needs they do have, and even what workers exist. And so we're going to be working with that office to design this survey and then turn around and go out to industry and find out that very thing. What is the full range of jobs that are open in the space sector? What are those professions that are needed but unable to be filled? And how is it companies want their existing workforce programs to be improved? And so if you are involved in a space company right now and think you all might be interested in participating in this survey, please reach out to us, and we'll make sure we integrate you all in that survey. Obviously, we won't be able to touch every company in the sector, but we're trying to make this as representative as possible. So that way, when the White House and the National Space Council are making decisions, they actually do have a survey that's a scientifically valid representative sample that's statistically significant. All right, I think that just about does it for me. I think I have a little under 1 minute. That may be my best timing yet for sliding in under the wire and not stealing anybody's time.
I know you're usually pretty good. So that was really interesting about the survey, working with the White House. That'll be um, an important step because you do hear a lot of people talk about workforce development and the challenges that this industry has, but nobody seems to have verified whether that's really a problem or whether it's just a lack of creativity in reaching the people who are qualified for these positions.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. I think companies still think the model is we put up an announcement on our own website and magically everybody who was ever interested in space will see it. And
Yeah.
I think that's not how it's working these days. I think you got to go where the people are.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't want to make Miss Laura Forzik wait. It's time for What's Going On. Miss Forzik is the owner of space consulting firm Astrolytical, specializing in space science, industry, and policy, offering space career coaching services, some good successes there lately, and publishing industry reports. She serves as an advisor for Cislunar Space Development Company and for All Moonkind, and she is the VP of Research and Analytics for the Beyond Earth Institute. She serves as a mentor for the Brooke Owens Fellowship Program, and she is a NASA subject matter expert for planetary science missions. She has published 2 books now, Rise of the Space Age Millennials, and the brand new book, Becoming Off-Worldly, my personal signed copy. Thank you, Laura. It's beautiful. And fill us in on what's going on.
Thank you so much, Lee, and enjoy the book. And it's been 1 month since I published, so if all of you haven't gotten it yet, please reach out to me or go to the website or get it on Amazon. So the topic for this month's Conversations for the Future is space investment. So money, 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 right? That was a fun topic last year, let me tell you. So last year, you might have noticed a lot of money coming into the space sector. According to Space Capital, space infrastructure companies, so there's different ways to define space companies, right? But they define space infrastructure companies as receiving a record number of investments, $14.5 billion of private investments in 2021, more than a 50% increase from 2020, which was $9.8 billion. So that's just one space investors tally. You might find different numbers out there, but that's still impressive. And I think everyone would agree that last year was record breaking. You might have noticed SPACs. So SPACs were especially popular early last year. They got less popular as the year went on and more regulations started popping up, but they're still pretty popular. So you're still going to see special purpose acquisition companies doing those quick mergers to have space companies go public. That's going to continue in 2022. I think most people agree. And I think a lot of people are going to agree that 2022 is going to be just as successful as 2021. You know, we're still early in the year, so something still might go awry, but it does not look like the money is going to stop flowing, despite the fact that recent analysis has shown that SPAC companies, in particular, space SPAC companies, I mean, have not actually done very well. But that doesn't mean that the investments are going to stop, whether it's traditional public exits or whether it's continuing private investments or whether it's SPAC. Like there's just going to continue to be money flowing. And you see this just in the past few weeks. There's investment announced almost daily. And so I'm just going to go through a few of them. And I'm on an abridged schedule here. I think I only have 15 minutes this time to speak. but there's a lot. So I'm just gonna, go through some of these, and you can see just the diversity. And keep in mind, it's not just here in the United States, where traditionally there has been a lot of private money, but it's actually really global. And you're seeing rise in investments in certain areas, like in Europe and China, for example. And so just for example, yesterday, Aerospace Lab, which is in Belgium, I believe, raised 40 million euros, or the equivalent of $45.5 million in a Series B round. And you'll see that most of the investments are around that multi-million-dollar level. Some of them are just like single digits multi-millions. Some of them are hundreds of millions. A few of them go into the billions. So not too many though, but you do see a diversity of ranges when it comes to investments. And sometimes that is equivalent to the round or the progress that a company has made, or sometimes it's just equivalent to the hype. I'll be honest with you. I think a lot of times investments are really just equivalent to hype. And a lot of times space investors are investing in one thing to get their hands in another thing. And I'm no expert in investments. This is just what I understand of the industry as a scientist trying to understand financial investments. So moving on from the Aerospace Lab, ICEYE, which is probably familiar to most of you. They've been around a while. They are a synthetic aperture radar satellite imaging company. ICEYE, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. I think I am. ICEYE. They raised $136 million in Series D. So they've been around a while. They've been raising money for a while. eSpace, which is doing a space cloud server. That's actually becoming quite popular these days. They raised $50 million in seed funding. Now, I don't know how to pronounce this, so I apologize. Satellite. Satellite is an Internet of Things connectivity company. They want to operate a satellite network for IoT. They raised the equivalent of $11.4 million. Empower Technology, which does solar cells. And of course, it depends on your definition of a space company, right? But this company does solar cells for space applications. So they are a space company, but it really depends on how you define a space company, right? But Empower Technology raised $10 million in Series B funding. Oxford Space Systems, they do space antennas, deployable space antennas, and they raised the equivalent of $5.4 million, so on the lower end here. And also on the lower end, composite company, Atomic 6, which again, is that a space company? Sure. I mean, composites are in space hardware. They raised $3.2 million, and they raised it in convertible debt financing, which I don't know what that is. I'll be honest with you. So maybe someone in one of the future talks during this conference will be able to explain the differences in all the different investment types. Deorbit, that's a big one, right? They've been around quite a while. They are actually going to go public. They announced that through Breeze Holdings Acquisition Corporation, $1.28 billion valuation. Now, valuations can change. And we've seen this with some of the SPACs last year, where the valuations were actually lower than what they were initially announced to be. But at this point, Deorbit is currently valued at $1.28 billion, which is amazing. So, I didn't go into who they are. So they're a satellite decommissioning company. So you might see some hot areas being satellite servicing, space debris cleanup. Those are some really hot areas right now. And so Deorbit fits right in there. Orion Space, which is a Chinese company, they raised the equivalent of $47 million in Series A funding. And we're seeing a lot of Chinese private companies get investments these days. And when you say private companies and Chinese companies, there's a little asterisk, because it really depends on how you define a private commercial company in China. But a lot of times they are trying to become more commercial in the sense that we as Americans understand it, at least. And so you're seeing a lot more private investment into Chinese space companies. So Orion Space, they do space transportation, and they raised the equivalent of $47 million. Arc Edge Space, which does microsatellites. It's a Japanese company, I believe, and they raised the equivalent of $14.55 million in Series A. Epsilon 3, they do software for space missions, and they raised the equivalent of $2.8 million in seed funding. And Small Spark, which does launch technology, raised the equivalent of about $1.5 million. And you can see the diversity of investors that are investing in these things. some of the big names that have been around a while that are specific space investors are Space Angels, which is related to space capital, Seraphim, and Space Ventures, which is sort of crowdfunding platform for space investments. And so there's a whole lot more than that invest in space as part of their portfolios. And so there's a lot of capital that's just been around a while, a lot of different investment firms that have been around a while, but there's also a lot of new players. So if you go through some of these different investments, you might come across names that you've never heard of, new people who are getting involved in space who have never been involved in space before, which is really actually quite exciting because it brings in new ideas. It brings in different technologies from different sectors that might benefit the space company that is being invested in, right? It's sort of a two-way street when it comes to investments. Yes, there's money flow, but there's also a technology and idea exchange too. And so I believe it's actually a really good thing for space companies to be getting investments from outsiders, from people who have not traditionally been investing in space. If you want more information about different space investments, Payload, which is a space publishing media company, as well as a daily newsletter. They're excellent at providing these little tidbits. They do a term sheet every month. Their newsletter is daily, so they sometimes include it in the daily section, but you can just sign up. It's free. So a little plug for Payload right there. And there's other news companies and investment companies that put out news as well. For example, Seraphim just did a thing today that I didn't get a chance to read yet about deorbit and their plans to go public. So I am not an expert. I just have worked with space investors, but I'm not an expert in space investing. So you might want to hold some of your questions for the speakers that are going to be talking after me, but I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, that two-way street. I feel like the space industry has been a little bit more isolated and doesn't look outside, very focused on taking the technologies that we come up with and trying to make sure people know about them and can apply them commercially. But that opportunity to learn from other industries seems to be a little bit slower, a little less energetic.
So I just got notification from Lee that we need to take up more time here on this investment section here about what's going on in space investments. So I would actually like to hear from the audience as to what your predictions are for 2022. So for preparation of this talk, I was reading some of those predictions by investors, right? And it is interesting to see where they believe the next big areas of investment will be in the space sector. I already brought up one area, that satellite servicing and space debris removal, which are, I guess, distinct but related. And space transportation is always a big one, whether that's launching, rockets from Earth or whether that's actually the space tug concept, changing orbits, or even deep space propulsion companies, for example. So I think that's another area that might be very interesting. And of course, data. I mean, like whether it's a constellation for internet or whether it is some other means of IoT. There's just so many different demands for data that space can provide or space hardware can provide. So I'm curious to know from our audience where you think the big investments are going to be in 2022. Well, while you're thinking about that,
I've got some questions for you. But, do you know how they defined a space infrastructure company? What were the brackets on that?
oh, I did not look into that detail.
Yeah,
But
okay.
if you're curious, look at Space Capital. They are based in New York. They've been around a while, several years. I don't know how long they've been around, but yeah. So when you talk about the space economy, and I think we've talked about this in previous conferences, it really depends on how you define a space company, right? Is a company that uses space data for navigation or timing or Earth observation images? Is that a space company, or does it need to be defined by direct access to space, whether it's hardware or software on a space satellite? So there's different ways to define it. So when you look to see what space investments are, you might find different definitions just depending on who's included in that space sector.
Yeah, that's great information. We do have a question from Michael Bruno and Stan. I'm not sure if you're looking to ask a question. Are you looking to speak?
Sure. I
Yes.
had a quick
Go
question
ahead.
or comment for everyone, Laura and everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, so my question is, the space um, economy, you often see these $400 billion numbers, 350, $400 billion numbers. Anyone who's looked at that knows that that includes an awful lot of things that probably most people wouldn't consider space, and that have some double counting inherent in the way they put those things together. And my question is pretty simple. Does anyone think that investors are just jumping into the space industry based on these big numbers, or are they sophisticated enough to look at, say, these satellite manufacturing or the launch business or some particular segment of the market that's relevant to their investment? Or do you think, like, particularly retail investors are just running in after the hype of these big numbers that are projected to be trillions of dollars without understanding them? I'm just curious whether people actually make business decisions based on these sort of slightly overhyped numbers.
Yeah, I don't think you can categorize all space investors as one big thing, right?
Of course, yeah.
In general, I do think in general, people are taken by hype. And I think
Okay.
that, it's not just investors that are taken by hype. I think a lot of people are taken by hype in the space sector and outside. And it's just, there's a lot of reasons for that. People want to be involved in the next big thing, and they're seeing space as the next big thing. And whether they trust the numbers that, certain people put out, I don't know how much they trust them. I don't know how much they dig into them. Probably depends investor by investor, how much due diligence they're doing. But they're still going to be swept up in that hype, as we all are in some way or another. Every one of us on this call, right, is probably swept up in some excitement that we're like, yeah, maybe those numbers are a little bit exaggerated, but I still want in, right? And that's what those investors, I think, are doing. They also count on the fact that some of these companies are going to fail, and that's why they have a portfolio, right?
Right.
So if one succeeds, well, then it makes it worth it. That's the impression that I get, at least. I personally am not a space investor. I don't have that kind of money, but that is the impression that I get, that they're putting their money around knowing that a lot of them are going to fail, but they are hoping that they're going to be latching onto the next big thing. And, in some cases they have succeeded. And a lot of them also are jumping on the fact that SpaceX is hot, but SpaceX cannot, it's not publicly traded. They're raising money, sure, for accredited investors, but investors who want to invest in SpaceX cannot do so. So they find an equivalent in their minds of, oh, this is SpaceX like, or this one can grow like SpaceX or partner with, whatever it is. So I think a lot of times there's one company or one thing that's happening that an investor is excited about, and they want to do something similar to that. They want to latch onto something similar and be involved in that.
Yeah, I think the good news there is that space is a growth industry. It's going to be huge. It's for all the reasons we all know, it's going to be significant for the economy, regardless of what the actual number is. So I think the impact of space is huge, and there's a different number that's how big the market is and the market by segment. And I think those are different. The other thing, to Lee's question about or to your thoughts about what's coming in 2022, I just wonder to what extent the so-called Starship Singularity, to what extent, if we get to $100 per kilogram, as Elon said in his update, does that, is there a new wave of investments coming along that take advantage of that? And that's where I haven't seen a lot yet. And I don't know whether that's because people haven't had the time to think about what business models make sense at that level, or whether it's because there's concern about the risk that Starship might not happen, or it might happen to the degree. And I don't know what the risks are there from an FAA perspective, from a technology perspective. One thing that occurs to me, though, in terms of SpaceX's long-range viability, if for some reason Starlink doesn't work out, maybe because all the other companies get together and don't allow the proposal to go through, or the FCC puts a kibosh on or something, if SpaceX doesn't start generating the bulk of its revenue from Starlink, it just won't have the funds to do everything it wants to do. So I just don't know. But to me, it strikes me that I want to see more business models related to that lower cost to orbit that would be an order of magnitude or better than where it is today.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments on that. I think that some of the Starship Singularity is already built in, and that's some of the
Okay.
hype. I mean, we've been talking about that for a while, and those number, that $100 number, has been out there in some form or other for probably the past year. And I think a lot of people see that as a game changer, just as they've demonstrated that that was a game changer in the last downshift in the cost of launch. So I think there's a projection there and that people are baking those into their numbers. Another point is 2015 is when really things started ramping up in space investment, private money, space investment, right? And now we're in 2022, which is the 7 years. That's usually the long end of what somebody would be looking for an exit. And those are we're going to get some rude awakenings, or maybe already have on a number, but that 7 year clock that's been ticking, we're here now. And I think that may, inform some of the future investments, is what happened to the 2015s, what happened to the 2016s as we head into next year. And then one final point is when we had in November, we had our Space Money event, Space Money. And we had a panel of space investors, Seraphim, Starbridge, an angel investor, and uh, no, I can't remember the other one, but each of those four companies that were represented had different investment criteria. So one of them was Seraphim was very focused on the technology, and they didn't worry so much about the management team because they figured, well, if that doesn't work out, we got the technology, we're ahead of the game there, and we can move on. The angel investor in that group was focused on the management team, right? Is the talent there? What do we need to do to develop the talent into the next phase? And then not Seraphim, Starbridge is very focused on whether there's a market. It's an established and proven market for what's out there. And so each of those drivers, each company has to decide what their investment criteria are. And I think that panel really demonstrated that well. Let's see. We have some questions in the chat. Where do you rank EO in regards to the growth sectors? Higher than space tugs, but below ComSats, for example, Laura?
It's hard to know. So Earth observation has been, an application of satellites for so many decades, right? So is
Yeah.
communication, but now we're seeing communications change from, GEO to LEO, for example, and it's becoming sort of a hot area. There's almost a competition going on with communication satellites right now, it seems. And space tugs is one of those unproven technologies that is just starting to get demonstrations, and so I think we're going to see more growth there as that concept is demonstrated, as the business concept is demonstrated. The technology also needs to be demonstrated too, so we're starting to see that happen. Earth observation is almost easy because the technology is there. There's ways to improve the technology, sensors and SAR. I mean, there's just so many different ways to get more and more and more data, but it's almost saturated. And what's the hot area now is not necessarily getting the data, it's processing the data. How do you go through with different algorithms and different ways of processing data? How do you go through that and get something intelligent out that you can send to a user, and a user can easily parse through it rather than just having raw data, right? And I see our next speakers here. So I'll just wrap up in saying I don't know to the answer to your question as to where that ranks, but it'll be interesting to see how the technology plays out with some of the newer technologies compared to some of the older technologies that are being used in new ways.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I hope the sales of your new book, Becoming Off-Worldly, continue to grow. And certainly everybody here should be on Amazon or on the Astrolytical website to find Laura's book.
Thank you, Lee. Appreciate it.
All right. Our next speaker is Rod Pyle. He's an author, journalist, television producer, historian, and editor-in-chief of Ad Astra magazine. He has written 17 books on space history, exploration, and development, including Space 2.0, Innovation the NASA Way, missions to the moon, and Destination Mars. He has written for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory that he'll be talking about today, Caltech, Wired, Popular Science, Huffington Post, Space.com, and other periodicals and websites. He's just really good with a keyboard or a pen. Rod also co-authored and lectured for the Apollo Executive Leadership Program for NASA's Johnson Space Center and the Conference Board. So tell us what's new at JPL, Rod?
I would love to, and thank you for the extra breathy introduction. I haven't had one of those in a while. I like that. So this was an interesting project. It was book number 18 for me, and it's the third or fourth time I've done this for JPL. So they do a number of annual reports, and I've done 2 or 3 of the different ones, but this one in particular is interesting. It's got the very non-whimsical title of technical highlights fill in the year 2019, 2020, 2021. But it's a really cool book because it's about 80 pages, 85 pages, and about 30 to 35 stories of kind of their greatest hits of that year, if you will. And the hard part is going to these PIs or these chief engineers or whoever it is you're doing the story with and sitting down. And I try to give it an hour, even though I know I don't need that much time, because, a lot of these people have been working on this stuff for a decade, and it's their life. So to go in, and I've seen some of the other media people do this, go and say, okay, I got 10 minutes, tell me everything. And, you see the heart drain out of these poor folks. So I give it more time, but in essence, what I'm really saying between the lines is, look, we got 400 words to tell your whole story. And so usually what happens is they start reaching for a dry marker and turning around to the whiteboard behind them, and the hands are shaking. It's like, no, you need to use your words, So that's what the project is. It's short stories of some of the coolest things they're doing with a lot of pictures. So it's a graphics book, and the audience in broad terms is the general lay public, but the book is specifically printed and distributed to NASA headquarters, where the money pipeline flows from, and Congress and the executive branch, to say, we're still here, we're still doing cool stuff, keep sending the cash. So if I may screen share, I will go to, okay, my picture just changed dramatically. Can you see?
We see your slides, but they are
in,
they're not in presentation mode.
Right,
yet.
so let's change that. There we go. Should be
There
in
you
presentation
go.
mode now.
Looks great.
Very good. All right. So this is the sign outside of Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the lovely mountains of Southern California above Pasadena. It's always lists its address in Pasadena, although it's just kind of barely, it's actually in Flint Ridge, but we like to say it's in Pasadena because it's run by Caltech, as you can see just below the JPL sign there. Oh, this is my book commercial. That was 7 of the 18. I also the editor-in-chief of Ad Astra magazine. And if you have a chance, if you're not a National Space Society member, we're now selling these in 1,100 bookstores across the US and Canada. This latest issue is really fun for 2 reasons. I got to talk about the Chinese space program, which is something that interests me quite a bit. And I got to hire my cover illustrator to do this really cool cover, which I later found out wasn't completely original. I guess Time Magazine did something like this, but what I loved about it was who's first, right? So yeah, us are the Chinese. All right, so these are previous issues of this book. We always try to go for a strong graphic cover. And just a little bit about JPL. It's the only NASA field center that isn't actually managed by NASA. It's managed by Caltech. So it's founded in the 1930s. Founded, I use with quotes because it was a bunch of Caltech grad students firing rocket engines. They started on campus after one particularly unfortunate loud kabang. The Caltech campus said, you really shouldn't be doing that here. Go find somewhere rural to do it. So rural in Pasadena back in the 30s meant the Arroyo Seco, which is a big dry gulch just west of town. And it's still kind of a big dry gulch, actually. So they started firing off engines over there, and that's partially how Jet Propulsion Laboratory ended up. being up at the top of the Arroyo Seco and nestled in the foothill of the mountains. By the 40s, they had a deal with the U.S. Army. They were making jet-assisted takeoff engines, which is where the jet and JPL comes from. And in the late 1950s, the United States was working on the Vanguard program to get our first artificial planet in space, which is what we used to call satellites. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union surprised everybody by orbiting Sputnik, and Vanguard exploded 3 weeks later on the pad. It was a civilian/U.S. Navy program. So the government came to Jet Propulsion Laboratory and said, hey, how fast can you guys get a satellite built and flown? And they said, I don't know, 3 months? Great, done. So they managed to get our first satellite up, Explorer, in 1958, early 1958. Then in the 60s, the whole planetary robotic exploration impulse really took flight. Some of you, very few of you actually, but people my age are old enough to remember the Ranger program, just barely, which was a series of probes flown to the moon. And the way to get close-up pictures of the moon was to fly into the moon. So you literally flew straight up and impacted the moon, and you got these great pictures of anything bigger than a dinner plate if you got close enough. But it took, of the, I think it was, I don't know, 9 or 11 Ranger flights, it took the first half of them to get past the failures, and then finally they're able to pull it off. And from there on, there was no stopping JPL. They started the Surveyor missions to the moon, the Mariner missions to Mars and Venus, and finally the outer solar system in the 70s and 80s. And it's about 6,000 to 9,000 employees. So if you work at JPL and you run into somebody in Southern California, they say, oh, do you know so-and-so? It's, you know, it's like any other largest. It's like asking somebody who's going to Boston University, oh, did you ever meet Jeff? You know, there's a lot of people at JPL. So generally the answer is no, unless they're particularly well known. But for instance, if you ask anybody who works at JPL, hey, do you know Rod Pyle? They'll say, who the hell's that? So here's a picture in the upper left of the campus.
I just want to jump in and so this rocket body that's about to smash into the moon, by no means the first of anything smashing into the moon, right?
No, we've smashed lots of things in the moon. The Soviet Union crashed Luna. It's either Luna 1 or Luna 2. What was particularly cute about that was they had made this, I think it was a beryllium ball. It looked like a soccer ball, and each of the little chunks that it would explode into had the sign of the USSR on it, the flag of the USSR. So the whole goal was to just scatter Soviet Union pendant pieces across the surface of the moon. It probably vaporized on impact, but it was a fun idea. So lots of things. Rocket stages smashed in the moon. We had the deliberate impactor from the, I think it was the L-Cross mission down near the lunar South Pole, because we want to see if there was water there. So if you make a big enough kabang, you know, you can analyze the spectra of what comes up. And in fact, in the early 60s, there were actually plans in both Russia and the US to detonate nuclear warheads on the moon. Why, you might ask? Well, the scientific impulse was, we can study the spectra of the explosion and get some idea of better idea of the composition of the moon. That's possible, but mainly
we get to make a big boom.
Yeah, mainly it was, look at us. We tower over you Americans, you know, and we were thinking the same thing. Fortunately, nobody did it. So yeah, the moon's been relatively unmolested in a major sense, but lots of smaller bodies have crashed there. On the right, you see the face of JPL from the early 70s. That has changed now. It's was one of the earlier NASA facilities to diversify after the Marshall Space Flight Center in the 1960s, which actually that was the impulse of Werner von Braun, who sort of pushed that program. Interesting man in so many ways. So let's jump into the meat of this here. Uh-oh, why isn't that working? There we go. Just one thing about the kind of people that work at JPL. This is from 1965. In the upper left, you see Mariner 4, first flyby of Mars by a spacecraft, took 22 grainy low resolution pictures, about 200 pixels by 200 pixels, you see there in the lower left. And those images came back digitally. So it was a TV camera that was converted into binary and sent back to Earth. Took about 7 hours to get each image. So you can see how our bandwidth has improved over the years. Well, the JPL people were impatient and they didn't want to wait for those black and white photo prints to come out of the lab dripping wet. So they took the printouts of the binary that came back from that image to the left there, or one like it, and cut those strips of paper out of the printer, cut that paper coming out of the printer into little strips and taped it up on the wall, ran down to the local art store and got some colored chalk and made this lovely drawing that you see this guy working on to the right here. This still hangs at JPL today. It's kind of one of those, little moments of miniature worship when you walk into I think it's in building 180, which is the main office building. It's very cool to see it, but it just shows the kind of people that work there. It's like, look, I can't wait around. An interesting minor tangent here. When the guys went down to the art store to pick up chalk, they told them what they needed, and they said, well, we either have blue and green or orange and yellow and brown, so take your pick. So had it gone otherwise, you might have had a first image of Mars being blue-green, but thank goodness that didn't happen. So this is the book this year, 2021 technology highlights. And those aren't cells to the left. Those are little ice crystals. This is a simulated picture, not a real one. We always try to use something kind of abstract for the cover because it draws in the interest of the reader, especially, we hope, Congress people, he said with his hands cupped over his mouth. And this is a picture of a sample being taken out at Europa. So we're soon going to have Europa Clipper, which is an orbiter. The whole idea is to sample some of the plumes that are coming up out of the surface, the cracks in the surface that we think are warm water that turns cold once it exits the planet's crust, and see if there are any organic compounds in there or other things of interest. So that little splotch in the left there that I just put an arrow on, we hope is a biomolecule. And the idea is if you scoop up a sample from orbit and analyze it, you can find a biomolecule, which sounds pretty cool. I mean, that's a very smart way to go about it. You don't have to land on the moon and drill through the surface or melt through the surface or scrape things up. You just fly by and grab something. But of course, because this is space exploration, it's not that easy. And I apologize for this one. I only had one image, which is the one out of the book. Whoa, where did that come from? Hold on a second. My spreadsheet opened for some reason. So each of these I'll start with a need. So what was the need here? Well, we wanted to gather samples from the plumes of Enceladus or Europa. So you've got ice particles spewing from cracks in the surface, and it sounds easy. You just want to fly through them with a scoop and pick them up. How do you do that? Well, you're scooping at orbital velocity, but what is that velocity? It turns out that velocity is critical. So JPL has been working on software to try and figure out what the proper speed is. So you've got biomolecules, you hope, present in these inside the ice crystals. And that's a little computer simulation up there on the left of what happens when you grab an ice crystal and you've got amino acids in it. And the crystals are being drawn into the scoop or hitting the scoop at hypervelocities and literally vaporize in a femtosecond. Now, if it's done at the exact right speed, if there's any biomolecules in there, they ionize and then you can see them. But if you're going too fast, the crystals fragment and destroy that process. If you're going too slow, the biomolecules may fail to ionize. So this is the kind of thing that specific departments at a place like JPL agonize over. So what's the sweet spot here? Well, I'm not going to show you the calculation because we've only got a short period of time together, but it turns out, just in case anybody asks you at your next party, it's 1.8 to 3.7 miles per second, which is good to know, because otherwise, if you go up there and you don't do things properly, you're definitely not going to get an indication. And by the way, if anybody remembers the Viking project to Mars, those were two orbiters and landers from the 1970s that arrived and landed in 1976. That's kind of an example of a good idea that didn't quite work out. So the Viking landers carried a life science package. It was as clever as could be for the time, but those life science detection experiments were based on life as we understood it at the time on Earth, which is basically, hey, let's scoop up some dirt, we'll inject some nutrients and some water in it and watch what happens. And in 3 out of 4, very little happened. In the 4th one, there was a reaction, but apparently it was chemistry, not life. So the more you can figure out how to do these things properly before you leave Earth, obviously the better. So this is sort of the state of the art of what we hope would be life science at Enceladus and Europa. Next story, to boldly rove. So we all know about the rovers on Mars, the Mars exploration rovers, Curiosity and Perseverance. These are the flagship missions. They're big, they're billions of dollars, they do great things, but they're very slow and you have to be really careful with them because they're expensive. And ever since the end of the MER missions, where we had Spirit and Opportunity on Mars, we now only have one at a time. You don't want to risk them, right? So the idea behind these mini rovers is to use them as add-ons to the large rover. So here's a picture of one trying to work its way over a fairly small rock. These are lightweight on Earth. They're really lightweight on Mars, which is only a little over 30% of Earth gravity. So they can scamper around pretty effectively. So the idea is to have a bunch of these loaded up in the back of a rover. If anybody's ever seen a World War II movie, it's almost like the way depth charges eject off the back of a destroyer, right? So Perseverance goes somewhere interesting. It sees a crevice or a cave or a rock overhang or something, ejects one of these things out of the back. It unfolds once it hits the ground and skitters off. They've got a fairly simple instrument package because they're small, but if you got cameras and a spectroscope and a few other things, probably no sampler, that's pretty good. Because if you get down a cave and you see a little 6-legged green thoat down there waving at you, then you just made a really worthwhile discovery and it didn't cost you much. So one of these is called Puffer, and it was developed originally by a grad student at UC Berkeley. And here's some of his early work. That thing that looks like a Terminator or a transformer, excuse me, in the second photo down on the left is actually a folding fabric circuit board. So you have the wheels on these folds on the sides of the circuit board. So the thing could store flat, and then once it hits the ground, it actually unfolds and drives around, a little tail hanging down the back. And there's an early prototype there on the right. You know, these are between hundreds of thousands and maybe $1 million each to build, which still sounds like a lot. Could be less with off-the-shelf componentry, but compared to a full-size rover, it's nothing. So here's a smaller second-generation Puffer next to a quarter. You can see how small they are. And the latest iterations of this are autonomous, which uses AI for some interesting things I'll discuss in a second. These 4 pictures to the right here, laterally 1, 2, 3, and 4, you can see that once a Puffer has popped off the back of the rover and unfolded, if it drives over to a crevice that's really got low clearance, it can refold its wheels, if you look at picture number 3 here, and actually be almost flat when it crawls into these cracks and crevices. So this is exploration on an exponentially cooler scale than you can do with a rover the size of a Mini Cooper, right? Because now you can go anywhere and do just about anything. And if you lose one of them, we'll just send another one after. That's a close-up of it crawling into a crevice. It looks kind of pathetic this way, but it actually is very cool. So as I said, they're low mass. They can go into all kinds of places bigger rovers can't do. And then we're particularly interested in caves and caverns and pits on Mars. This may be a bit under the task of getting into a large crater or pit, but for smaller ones, it might be able to drop in over the side. But the point is, when you get in these covered areas, they're protected from radiation and they moderate thermal extremes. So there's a chance, especially in the volcanic regions, if there's some geothermal heat coming out of Mars, which it appears there is from the latest work that InSight has been doing, there's a chance that there's going to be microbial life down there living with water vapor, a source of water vapor. So, you know, this may not be the exact right probe for that. That's going to take some thinking, but the further in you can go to these little dark and scary places that the big machines don't want to go, the more at least leading indicators of things there that you might want to be able to see. So it can survive, we think, a 10 to 15 foot fall on Mars, again, with the lighter gravity. And as I pointed out earlier, at least on some of the prototypes, the circuitry is printed on a fabric substrate, so they're fairly flexible. And by the way, each of these projects has some commercial applicability. It's a longer story to go into how that process takes place, but JPL and NASA, as you all know, are very, very generous with their data, share most of it with the world, unless it's something that has particularly secured national security implication. And so it's not only good for commercial companies in the United States, but really for people all over the planet. Bigger is better. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about Aperture. So we've just seen the James Webb Space Telescope go up. Magnificent mission so far, but boy, you want to talk about a white knuckler with over 400 individual functions it had to perform to unfold and clamp and get ready to do its business out there a million miles from Earth. I don't know about you guys, but when I saw the design for that mission, I had the same reaction I had when I first saw how Curiosity was going to land, which was kind of a, what were you, is this really the simplest way to do this? Well, when you've got a big space telescope that's got to fly on small rockets, it is the simplest way to do it because you've got to fold everything up, and it's a major do and makes it very expensive. So how can we get around this? Well, one way is to use a synthetic optical aperture. You've probably, most of you heard of synthetic aperture radar. This is a synthetic optical aperture, which works in a different way. Space telescopes are the future of astronomy. The more junk we get in orbit, the harder it is to see things out beyond. So increasingly, we think space telescopes are going to be more and more important because they not only they're able to fly above all the junk in orbit, but they also bypass limits of the atmosphere and are better at observing infrared and even ultraviolet, because the atmosphere tends to make that difficult. And there's also just pollution along with refraction. So for a lot of reasons, we like space telescopes. So what are the constraints? Well, as I said, the large ones like Webb are complex and very expensive to fly. And a current rocket fairing, even on the Falcon Heavy, is limited to about 15 feet in diameter, maybe 25, 28 feet in length. So you've got to pack these things up in a fairly small package. And that's about the maximum size you've got to launch at this point, at least until Starship's flying. So what's the answer? How about rotating synthetic aperture telescopes? So this is a close-up of the experimental unit. That's just a regular old camera lens there. That little white stripe is a strip, if you can use your imagination a bit, that represents a mirror about 15 feet across and maybe a foot wide. So basically, you've got in the ultimate design of this, you've got this big single strip of a mirror, and you take multiple exposures, rotating that thing, and then you build those exposures up by overlapping them and processing them, and that gives you the equivalent of a 15-foot diameter mirror. So if that strip was, say, 2 feet wide and 30 feet tall and did that rotational process, you now have the equivalent of a 30-foot aperture telescope. So you can see that you're getting a lot of bang for your buck here. And this experimental version was made with off-the-shelf components, by the way, but it hasn't flown yet. And it only has to rotate through 180 degrees. It doesn't have to do a full 360 because obviously you're on both sides of the central pivot point. In the estimation of the designer, it could lead to 100 meter or 300 foot wide instruments. That's a bit of a do that require very large rockets or some unfolding, but compared to Webb, it would be quite simple. So here's a sample image. On the left is the moon through the first take with that little tiny synthetic aperture rotating SLR lens that I showed you. And to the right is the processed image. So the example here, it's still fairly low res, but it does give you at least an idea of how you can get something for nothing out of image processing, and it's getting better every day. And because we like to save money at NASA, here's the camera they use to test it. So instead of building some big expensive bespoke rig, they just use a standard off-the-shelf SLR with that little tiny aperture in the lens. But at least in principle, it works. And this could lead to real huge breakthroughs in optical astronomy off Earth for a relative pittance. On the other hand, sometimes smaller is better. What's this funny looking thing? Looks like a pepper grinder. It's actually an atomic clock. So we like atomic clocks because timekeeping on spacecraft is really critical for navigation. You've got to have accuracies down to a billionth of a second, not because we just like to know what time it is, but because when you're flying all the way out someplace like Jupiter or Saturn, if your timekeeping and navigation is not spot on, you could be hundreds of thousands of miles, if not more, off, and you want to be a lot closer than that. Atomic clocks of the accuracy of the one I just pictured have results in billionths of a second, which results in a delivery within a yard of what you're aiming for out there, which, is the thickness of some of the rings of Saturn. So that can be kind of critical because you don't want to run into those things. Now, the systems we've been using on the ground were large and power hungry. Sorry?
It's interesting you chose to call it a yard instead of a meter.
Well, so yeah, everybody there says meters, but because I write for the lay people all the time in the United States, I use yards and feet. And I personally still have a little trouble converting in my head, I have to confess. But just so it's said in the magazine, we say imperial and then metric, but yeah, I do tend to use yards.
It goes a long way. It just really illustrates your mode of thinking, the level of expertise that you have in all of this information, and then compounded by your ability to translate it for a lay audience is really spectacular.
That is a very generous assessment. What you might also say is he grew up in a time of non-metric units and never bothered to learn metric, but I like your interpretation a lot better. So thank you. So atomic clocks can be big, heavy, and really power hungry, and it was hard to build them to fly, and you ended up having all the hardware on Earth, and now you're tying up the Deep Space Network, which is NASA's a series of radio dishes distributed around the Earth in 3 points to do all this navigation from the ground. That's about as small as they get on the ground. This thing is a little bit bigger than a sugar cube, and it uses it's called a micromercury trapped atomic clock, and it basically has particles bouncing back and forth that you can measure the travel rate of with an optical sensor. And here it is next to a sugar cube on the left. So you can see it's pretty darn small, and its power requirements are minimal. And power is everything in space, as you may remember from Apollo 13. Because power supplies are big and bulky, and whether they're solar panels and or batteries and or atomic in nature, they have a lot of mass, and you want to use that mass for instrumentation and experiments. So if you can keep the navigational and propulsion technology small, that's very helpful. So this is a little bigger than that measurement's a little off. It's closer to 3/4 of an inch. But it's 1,000 times more accurate than the current model, which is down here. That was about 6 years ago. It was about 1.5 feet long. So you can see the comparison of the new one over there. And it's 1,000 times more accurate. So when I'm writing these things, they throw around these numbers like, oh, it's 1,000 times or exponential or, an order of magnitude better. At a certain point, that almost becomes meaningless. So it's like, this is why sometimes NASA comes up with silly infographics. I don't know if you remember it, but there was a video infographic done on SLS of how many elephants worth of propulsion it was putting out with these elephants spilling out the bottom. That one's kind of infamous, but it does give the public, the general public, an idea of what's going on. And frankly, when you're dealing with Congress and you send this wonderful, polished, expensive book to them, it usually goes to congressional aid and ends up becoming, reading in the men's and ladies' rooms or something. So you want to make it as accessible as possible. So in this case, we just say it's 1,000 times more accurate the current model, which means you can get to a meter within where you want to go, roughly, which is great. And because there's less mass, you can fly longer missions with less fuel and more mass used for instrumentation. And here's just a graph of how these things work. It's beyond my pay grade to really fully explain it, but you've got these mercury ions bouncing back and forth, and you measure them with a photomultiplier, and then somebody makes sense out of that. Now, speaking of navigation, Here's, I think, one of the coolest things I saw this year. Current spacecraft tend to be navigated from Earth. They're guided from Earth. They have star sensors on them, which is basically just a photocell pointing out where we hope a star like Canopus is going to be. But to navigate that way can be tricky. It can be easy to lose that star signature. It ties up time with the deep space networks. And when you're getting out to the outer solar system, the delay time of radio going back and forth can be substantial in the many hours. And the star trackers are difficult to keep aligned sometimes. So JPL has been working on a project to use high frequency pulsars as essentially lighthouse beacons. And these are rotating neutron stars that are spinning out a lot of radiation from their poles. So they blink and essentially look like lighthouses out in space. Now they don't move around, right? They're really far away. So in particular, we're interested in millisecond pulsars that emit radar frequency, X-ray frequency. And this was actually derived from technology used on Perseverance's Pixel X-ray camera. And they realized they could use the exact same components to do tracking of these X-ray pulsars. So again, it's kind of a complicated technology tale, but basically you've got an X-ray source and this device called a polycapillary device, which uses millions of tiny glass tubes to focus down the X-rays because they behave differently than optical light. And then you've got the little sensor on the back. But the idea is that when you combine this with artificial intelligence, you've got spacecraft that can effectively self-navigate for long periods of time. So if you're getting out beyond the solar system where the Voyager 1 and 2 spacecraft are now, you just cut them loose. You let them off the leash and say, okay, rover, go find Alpha Centauri, do your thing. And they're able to do that. And you just do check-ins periodically. But part of the advantage here, as I was pointing out, is you're not tying up the deep space network with this constant conversation with distant spacecraft. If you ever have a chance to go over to Jet Propulsion Laboratory and stand in their control center, they have this really groovy, big view screen up front that looks like it's out of the Starship Enterprise that has all the different tracking stations and the chart of the signals going up and down. And it changes spacecraft every few minutes or every hour or so. But they're constantly rotating through, and NASA's flying a lot of stuff. The European Space Agency is flying a lot of spacecraft. We work with them on a lot of things. So you're constantly having to, it's like watching your father after he had 3 beers skipping between sports channels on Sunday. It's not the ideal way to navigate spacecraft. So if you can get them to have more and more autonomy, that's a good thing. So this image on the right here is a solar sail heading way out beyond the solar system with a very foreshortened beam looking at a pulsar. So like I said, you combine that with AI and now you really got something. How much time do I have left?
About 5 minutes, but we can go over just a little bit.
Okay. I may have to skip the last module, but I'll get as close as I can.
Okay.
So what's the need for getting small spacecraft in orbit around other planets and moons? Well, we need fuel and mass efficient ways to enter those orbits. As early as the 80s, we were experimenting with aero capture, which is where you have a spacecraft heading, in that case, to Venus, and you dip into the upper atmosphere just enough to slow it down. Because if you don't do that, you have to have a great big heavy rocket engine with lots of heavy fuel to effectively break it into orbit. So we're very interested in finding ways to do that don't require as much mass. So traditionally, for spacecraft at Venus and Mars, when we've done aerobraking, we just have the spacecraft configuration as it is, which is usually with the solar panels feathered back a bit. And it just barely touches the upper atmosphere enough to slow it down over the series of many months or a couple of years, which is great, but it's not as efficient as it could be. So here's an example of the difference when you have to break into an orbit. In the upper left, you've got Mariner 7, which is a flyby mission to Mars, fairly Spartan spacecraft. In the lower right, you have Mariner 9. So Mariner 7 was under 1,000 pounds. Here he is with the imperial units again. Mariner 9 was over 2,200 pounds. The main difference, besides slightly better cameras, was all that fuel mass. so that it could break into Martian orbit. So obviously, if you can do that without rocket engines and gas tanks, that's a good thing. So this is Mars Global Surveyor in a very speculative, nicely imagined image of it doing aero capture with those little speed streaks going to the right. It worked well, but in this particular case, one of the clamps on a solar panel had some issues, and it made this very tricky. The spacecraft still worked, but it could have easily been lost. So when you're dragging your foot effectively in the upper atmosphere to try and slow down a bit, solar panels are delicate things. So we'd like to have a way to do that. It's a little bit more robust, but not very heavy. And new designs, because technology is becoming so miniaturized, even with off-the-shelf components, they're a lot smaller. And that makes it a little easier to slow down because you have a lot less mass. And if you get your drag right, this can become a pretty efficient process, but there's still a better way. Now, we've currently got about 24 deep space probes in operation. Some are very large, some are just kind of large. They're all big and expensive, though. So for future missions, we'd like a lot of them to be CubeSat sized. I think this is a 3U CubeSat, if I remember correctly, or thereabouts. And much smaller mass and using as much off-the-shelf equipment as possible. So the idea here with this project is to use a drag skirt, which is basically just an umbrella made out of a strong fabric that deploys as you're getting near the body you want to slow down around. And it creates a lot more atmospheric drag while effectively protecting the spacecraft at the same time. It's really light. It's not terribly difficult to deploy, although the people that designed the antenna on the Galileo Jupiter probe might offer some argument about that. But there's a bunch of reasons that had problems, and should work and would allow you to carry a lot more science equipment on a much smaller package. So finally, I'll close with combating climate change, because I saved the hot topic for last. We need better detection of greenhouse gases on Earth to continue trying to fight climate change. Now, the way that we spot them today mostly has been done by high altitude aircraft and drones. You can get data from orbit, but it's not as exact and granular as we'd like. And if you really want the best indications, you need to fly over it at moderately low altitudes. While that's expensive and you can only do it every now and then, methane is one of the most important gases to track, and it's also very hard to detect. Here's a picture of a methane plume from an industrial source. So what we want is smaller, more accurate sensors that can give us global coverage, as we see here with all these hotspots, with a lot of frequency. How do you do that? Well, image spectroscopy has been picking up a lot of speed at JPL in particular over the last 20 years. It's good for a lot of things. One of the things it turns out it's good at is spotting methane, but you need really sensitive diffraction gratings to create that spectra. How do you make those? Well, JPL has the answer. They have a thing called the Micro Devices Lab, where they actually print diffraction gratings using an electron beam. So they used to be etched with mechanical tools. Now it's printed at nanoscale, so you can see the kind of scale we're talking about at the bottom there. These are in nanometers. So they may look a little rough and bulky, but they're really small. And this process is so exacting, it makes my brain hurt every time I go over there and look at it. And so you etch these things with electron beams. And now you can essentially, which is what they're doing at this project called Carbon Plume Mapper, you can build 20 satellites, have them flying in polar orbit, and you get global coverage 24/7 of these methane plumes and eventually other gases. And the plan is to have this going by 2024. That's a picture of the Carbon Plume Mapper. It looks like a garbage disposal, but I promise it's much fancier. And this will give us fairly granular coverage of methane emissions from all sources: agriculture, meat production, landfills, petroleum extraction, and other industrial sources. And once you can spot them, you can start getting more exacting about how you're going to mediate these things and begin to turn down, if you'll pardon the pun, turn down the gas a bit on climate change. So as I said earlier, most of these are shared freely with industry around the world. And this is one of the value propositions of a place like NASA and JPL in particular, is all this great stuff they're working on is available to the world for use. The full report, this book will be available in late March. If you go on the web and search JPL Technology Highlights, if you want to read it, the last, I think, 7 years are there. And as I said, this one will be posted in March. That's my commercial for my books. Thank you very much for listening. And do we have time for questions?
Sadly, no, but you answered so many just through your talk.
Well, thank you.
And, I still have questions that I wrote when you were here the first time that are in the kitty. So I think we'll have you back sometime and just do all the Q&A that's pent up.
I'll try to talk less next time.
No, keep talking more. You've got a lot to share. Thank you
so
so
much.
Rod.
Pleasure.
All right. All right, our next speaker is Ron Epstein. He's back. Excited to hear a good conversation between Tim and Ron. Ron is a managing director in America's Equity Research, covering aerospace defense and multi-industrials with large aerospace components. He is based in New York and covers companies listed in the United States, Canada, and Brazil. He joined Merrill Lynch in 2001. In the Institutional Investor All-America Research Poll, he ranked as a top 3 analyst in aerospace defense electronics for the last 13 years and number one for the last 7. He is fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society and is also a mentor for the Techstars Space Accelerator. He's frequently cited as an industry authority by trade and news publications and has appeared on numerous television programs. Previously, he worked as a research scientist in applied aerodynamics technology at Boeing Phantom Works. He was also an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Washington University in St. Louis, teaching fluid dynamics and control systems. He has a BA with obviously highest honors from Skidmore College, an MBA with honors from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and a PhD in mechanical engineering from Duke. Tim and Ron, take it away.
Hey guys, great to be here. Thanks. Good to see you again.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Ron. I as I was hearing your bio, I was thinking, how did someone with that education end up as if not the most important analyst in the aerospace sector for equities research, easily top 2 or 3. Like, what got you there?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm one of a group of us who do this, right?
Yeah.
I was working, I was at McDonnell Douglas. That's where I started my career, and then we got bought by Boeing. And to be candid, I just got really bored. I was like a mile deep in one thing, and I kind of wanted a bigger vantage point. So went back to school, got an MBA, learned a little accounting, and then was a summer intern at Merrill Lynch, and then never left. Still here.
Yeah. No, and that's really cool. We hear that a lot with people when they're making that shift. It's one day they're just like, I'm kind of done with where I'm at. And
I get to look at whole industries now, which is fun.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And seeing that across the breadth no doubt reinforces each individual component that you work on. You get to see analogs across different sectors. So for people who are not well versed in Wall Street, the financial markets, what is there like a scratch and sniff version of what you do?
Yeah, sure. So a couple different things, right? So it's a good question, because when people are like, you're a Wall Street analyst, so what's that mean, right? So like to my wife, like, what do you do? My kids ask me a lot, like, Dad, what do you do? So a couple things. I work for a pretty complex institution. So if you think about Bank of America, we've got a commercial bank, we have an investment bank, which are separate functions. Yep. We also own Merrill Lynch, right? So that's largely a retail brokerage, meaning mom and pops, Main Street, Wall Street, that kind of thing. So what do? I am responsible for looking at companies in the aerospace and defense sector and adjacent sectors. Right now we cover about 40 companies, although largely because of commercial space that's increasing. There's a lot of, as you all know, something we'll talk about, a lot of activity in the space right now. And what that coverage means is we publish, we on earnings, we have an investment opinion, and somehow or another, probably the bank is doing business with these companies, potentially from a capital markets perspective, raising capital. And when you think about what I do, back to the constituencies, I have professional investors, institutional investors who are my clients. That would be to folks out there, if you're invested in, a Fidelity fund or a pension fund, those folks. So I'm an advisor to them. I'm an advisor to our 25,000 brokers. So, when Bank of America upgrades or downgrades Northrop Grumman, that's me. So I give advice to them. And then on all of our capital markets activities. So if we do an IPO or anything like that, that all comes across my desk. And I have an independent view from the bankers. And at some point we have to see eye to eye.
Yeah. No, that sounds like a really cool job to be able to have that independent view into what's going on and be that objective voice and say, here's where I see this going based on these factors. I spent most of my career doing intelligence analysis, and it feels like there's a lot of analogs between that, where you're meant to be that honest broker, where the bankers may be saying like, no, we need to invest here. You're saying the data says we need to take this, look at it this way, look at it that way.
And I would say, to the credit of my firm, they really do care about what I think. If I don't like something, they want to know it. If I do like something, they want to know it. And if I don't like something, that doesn't mean they won't be involved, but they want to have a better understanding of the risks they're taking. So there really is, my work is very independent from what goes on in the investment bank.
Yeah. No, and I think, one thing I was struck as preparing for this interview and reading a lot of like the earning calls that you've been on, had never done that. I knew earning calls happen where CEOs are reporting their quarterly results. But when you look at the market the next day, you look at some of the commentary the next day, what you all as the analysts are talking about with the CEO dramatically changes what happens that next day. What is that like?
Well, it can, right? So, a couple thoughts. And different analysts take a different approach to the job. I look at my fiduciary responsibility to investors very, very seriously. I don't look at myself as my little franchise as an extension of PR of a company. Right. Sure. So I'm willing to ask hard questions because that's my job. I mean, and for an investment banker, it's different. For an investment banker, their client is the company.
Yeah.
For me, my client is the investor. And because of where I sit, could be your grandma. And I take that very, very seriously. So, I try to ask, the hard questions and hopefully kind of peel back the onion. And if you ask a good question that resonates, it can be pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's a forum it's a public forum.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's reminded, there was one last fall with, I think, Lockheed, where you more or less asked where's Lockheed going? There's like midway through the questions, nobody's yet to ask this. And you're like, there's no plan for you guys. You haven't mentioned what's next. Like, what's the plan? And that's the hard questions the public markets need to hear.
Well, a lot of times the question, I always find if you're going to be on an earnings call with a CEO in a public forum, if you're asking what's interest expense, it's a waste of time. Like that's right. I mean, you can talk to the CFO about that or whoever offline, but when the company looks like it's maybe going through a difficult strategic time or a period where there's a lot of decisions to be made, sometimes it's the obvious question. Like there was a call I did back with Boeing when they first got into the pickle with the 737, and the question was just, how could this happen?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Boeing, because I was, you noted in your talk here in this forum last year that defense contractors like Lockheed and Boeing are using investments in commercial space startups as like engines of innovation. You saw that happening in 21. How do you see that changing now as we go into 22, if at all?
Yeah, I think it's continuing, right? So I think an interesting example of that is Lockheed Martin, so particularly germane to sort of the space world. Lockheed's been an investor in Terran Orbital.
Yep.
They're also an investor in ABL Space, and so two early stage, or somewhat early stage, depending on which one, but two smaller innovative startups that they're an investor in. And what's fascinating about it, I mean, they're both interesting companies. They both bring forward really interesting technology, and arguably they can do it at a pace. And this isn't a knock on Lockheed. It's just they can do it at a pace that Lockheed couldn't. I sit in an organization, Bank of America has 250,000 employees, and the amount of red tape and things that we have to do to just kind of do something a little innovative can be tricky. It's the same thing at a big company. So, I think it's an interesting strategy for some of the defense contractors to, kind of, how can I say it, to propel forward some of the real innovative technology.
Yeah, and we're starting to hear from the Pentagon that they want more of that. That's something that they're starting to push more and more. And it'll definitely be interesting to see almost how far down those defense contractors reach for some of those really innovative startups that maybe are just in a seed round. And is that something that they're willing to take the risk on for certain technologies? That'll be really interesting to watch.
Well, if you look at a defense contractor, they're very, how can I say it? They've optimized contracting.
Yeah.
And maybe one of the, how can I frame it? One of the side effects is that they're not always the most innovative.
Oh, right.
Right. So it's a way to get some innovation in a framework, quick innovation in a framework that doesn't promote quick innovation.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And it's almost a microcosm of what government goes through with contracting things out. And so it's really interesting, and probably something the Defense Department should be looking at, is watching this and seeing which of these contractors does it well and how they do it.
Yep, that's right.
There's a lot of lessons that can be pulled up from that.
And they're all doing it a little bit different, right?
Yeah.
Different flavors, different way of doing it. Boeing has made for a while a big investment in Whisk. And that's not space, but that's some innovative, commercial aerospace.
Yeah.
I was a little critical of that because there's other places where they could be investing that are maybe more immediately relevant. But to be fair, it's a way to get some innovation in a way that's maybe quicker than they could do it internally.
Yeah. Well, and do you see some of these, I guess the main big merger, this Lockheed Aerodyne merger that fell through, is that going to impact some of these large firms?
Well, I think the takeaway from Lockheed Aerojet was, and Lockheed might be a little bit of a special case. They're a very big defense contractor, right? And one of the worries, and it kind of gets back to innovation, was as the industry has consolidated, have we paid a price in innovation? And I think the fear was coming out, and it's always administration. I was about to say administration specific, but that's not fair. The different administrations have a different flavor in kind of how things happen.
Sure.
And this administration's made it pretty clear that they want to keep some level of competitiveness, and the hope is that keeps some innovation alive at that high level.
Yeah.
And Northrop Grumman, bought Orbital ATK. And I think the thinking was, well, look, they could do that, so Lockheed can do this.
Yeah.
But that was the sole survivor of the big rocket engine producers who were publicly traded. And I don't think the Department of Justice wanted it to disappear.
Yeah. No, and Yeah, we'll definitely, I guess we'll see how that, or if that does anything other than just maintain the status quo. I mean, and speaking of status quo, it seems like for a lot of these contractors, it's almost a flat line of contracts from the government, whether it's continuing resolutions or just shifting priorities. Do you see that starting to trickle down to their supply chains and have an impact where those suppliers are starting to move away or just otherwise give those second and third order effects starting to happen?
Actually, I think you're seeing more of the traditional A&D supply base move towards defense, because defense, and the reason is because of the pandemic. The Department of Defense did an outstanding job of pushing liquidity into the big primes and, how can I say, forcing them essentially to push it down into their suppliers. So if you were a supplier and you had a more commercial oriented business that was really getting hit hard because of the pandemic, your defense business actually ended up being very, very, it was a good thing to have from a liquidity perspective. So I think you're seeing, more suppliers looking at defense as another angle to diversify for a rainy day. And the other nice thing about defense, and I think this is kind of evident to the supply chain, and you can see it with some of the new space companies. Let me just bring up Terran as an example. The government's a big contractor. It's a big customer of theirs. And government contracts are nice because the government pays. And their payment terms are generally well understood and generally pretty friendly. So as you're building out a business that might have a commercial aspect to it, if you have a nice foundation of government work, that's something you can build off of.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Has that, lack of government work impacted a lot of those companies that have gone public through SPACs over the last 9 months to a year?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, has it impacted it? And to some degree, right? So if you look at, let's just pick one, the first of the commercial space companies to go public, Virgin Galactic. Their government work's pretty limited, right? So it's really, really tied to this commercial business. Now they've got some, right? But it's kind of like government work under commercial terms, but it's pretty limited. So, they kind of live or die by that customer and that business model.
Right.
And the stock's been very volatile because of it. Now, all the SPACs have been in general, but if you don't have the access to a nice, consistent government foundation, it can make your life just more difficult. Another example, if you look at, say, Rocket Lab actually really hasn't been all that volatile. I mean, it's been volatile, but compared to some of the other companies, not as volatile, but they have a nice base of government business that they're doing.
Right. No, and I'm sure that, definitely helps calm the public markets at the very least.
That's right.
Yeah. Do you see other companies that maybe have that base thinking that, maybe 22 is a good year to continue the SPAC trend versus maybe others that were interested and see the results turning away?
Yeah, I would expect to, so to be clear, I'm not an investment banker, right? I don't
Sure.
SPACs, so just to tell everybody, but a SPAC is just an alternative way to do an IPO. Right. It turns out it's a quicker way. There's positives and there's minuses with it. Do I see more companies doing them? Yes, probably at a slower rate because the SPAC market itself kind of got painted with a weird brush. Could you see companies come public that are maybe farther along that might do a more traditional IPO path? Yeah, probably. I think you'll see a mix of both.
Yeah. No, we've heard that there's not a return to, but this idea that doing the deliberate nature of an IPO with all of its regulatory requirements and the like might be a way for some of these space companies to instill trust ahead of actually going public.
And a SPAC is can be a complicated transaction because it's sort of this weird merger with another company.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen in terms of what you're communicating and how you're doing things. Where if you just do a straight up IPO, there's just one cook in the kitchen and an advisor, and it's a different process. And like I said, there's pluses and minuses with both of them. But so I would expect to see both going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. During the pandemic, we saw a surprising, not stability, but continued investment and innovation in the space sector that it didn't seem to drop off like a lot of other sectors did. Is that, what was the most surprising part of that for you when you were looking across the sector?
So I would say this, I mean, and it's broader than just space. For having, covered the sector for over 20 years and worked in the sector.
Yeah.
Aerospace and defense was sort of this, and it's just sound horrible to say, but from a innovation perspective, a little bit of a backwater. Things didn't move that quick.
Yeah.
You had a couple things going on the side. Obviously you had SpaceX around for a while and Blue Origin, but they were kind of considered different because they had a different funding source, and maybe they were thought of as a bit of a hobby. But now things have really changed. What's really, I think, fascinating and exciting is you have so much going on in space, both in terms of spacecraft, space infrastructure, launch. I mean, you can kind of look through the numbers, right? I mean, it's really remarkable about the numbers of the size of investments being made across the whole space stack. But it's not just space.
No.
It's electrification of commercial aircraft. It's people, it's looking at hydrogen, looking at hybrid, eVTOLs. It's so for a young engineer getting out of school today, particularly in aerospace, it's a really exciting time where, for a long time, you got an aerospace degree, you can only go work at Boeing if you wanted to work on an airplane and stay in North America. It was really, now there's a whole multitude of things you can do. So, from that perspective, it's a very, very exciting time in the space. And it's was I surprised that the pandemic didn't slow it? Honestly, not really, right? Because it's bigger than the pandemic.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, these are trends. I hate to use sort of the jargon, but these are kind of mega trends that a pandemic's not going to stop.
Okay.
Right. Space is a big place, right? And electrification's a big thing. And so and I think to some degree it slowed things a little bit because it made working more complicated and so on and so forth. But it's a super exciting time to be, in some ways, my son's in college studying mechanical engineering.
Yeah.
I'm almost a little jealous of like when he gets out of school, all the interesting things he'll be able to do.
Yeah. No, because it seems like, easily 40, 50, 60 years now, the speed of a flight for commercial transportation has more or less stayed the same other than the Concorde. And that was it. You had it was whether you had a narrow body or wide body for aircraft in the sector, and space was your government. And now everything's seems to be changing fast. So I would agree. It's an exciting time.
It's a remarkable time. And I think there's got to be a lot of credit given to, those guys who are just hobbyists, right?
Yeah.
That, SpaceX changed the game and Blue Origin did. And I think they opened doors and they proved things to, I think, the broader markets and the government that, hey, you know what? A commercial entity can do this.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah. No. And so on the theme of, the next generation, we've heard, from a handful of organizations that are investors, venture or family office type ones, that they have a lot of trouble finding analysts and that analytic support in the aerospace, specifically space, but just in general, that those workers are hard to find. Your bio is one that is probably not what comes to mind when somebody thinks, oh, a financial analyst for a major bank. What is it you would say to people that, what what kind of people can and maybe should start looking at being and entering the financial analyst track?
Yeah, so it's funny you should ask that, and this is not an advertisement for this, but I'm looking to hire a couple of people right now, and and maybe it's my own bias, but I like looking at engineers. You can learn accounting, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you know how to do a differential equation, you can learn how to do accounting. And it's and I find and this is true, I think, for anything. If you like what you're doing and you have a passion about what you're doing, you'll be successful at it. So for folks that have an interest in aerospace or space or defense, that analyst role can be a lot of fun because you get to look at everything. You're not limited to just one part of one system. So to someone that likes that, like I tell people, I could never do my job, or at least not as successfully, if I was covering retail, because I just don't care. I mean, I order stuff from an LLB and catalog. I mean, that's me, right? I really don't care. But as long as you're covering and working in an area that you've got a passion for, it's very rare where, for myself, I actually think about my job as a job.
Yeah.
Of course, there's times you travel, you get tired, and this, that, but you like what you're doing. And I think I think people have to bear in mind, both employers and potential employees, that that you got your degree in mechanical engineering. That's cool, you can do that, but you can also do a lot of other things, and you can apply those skills, and vice versa.
Yeah, you can't train passion.
Yep, that's right.
Great conversation, guys.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Ron. This is
it's been
my
really
pleasure.
Good. Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, I think a lot about the labor market for space and all the complaining that goes on about how we can't find anybody. And I'm like, have you called those 3,000 people from Peloton? Probably some engineers, probably some technicians.
But you know what the big trick is? And this is the double-edged sword of it being such an exciting time. There's a lot of different things people can do.
Yeah.
You can go work in eVTOL. You can go work on a CubeSat. I mean, if you want to work at Boeing, you can go work at Boeing, but you don't have to. And there's so many options out there now. It's a good problem, I think, right? That there's so many other things you can do.
It's exciting. Well, thank you so much. Great to have you back, and hopefully we'll see you again another time.
Yeah, thank you. Yep, you bet.
Our next speaker is Steve Wolf. He is president and co-founder of the Beyond Earth Institute, a policy think tank committed to developing the policy and legal framework to enable the creation of economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. Steve will share with you the findings from a recent Beyond Earth study on options for financing large-scale infrastructure and habitats. Tim Christman was a participant in that study. Steve is also Deputy Executive Director for Global Spaceport Alliance and partner at CWSP International. He serves as the Space and Board of Editors for the Journal of Space Philosophy, which I'm eager to ask about. Steve served in Washington as the Executive Director of the Congressional Space Caucus and drafted the Space Settlement Act of 1988. The bill was signed into law as part of the NASA Authorization Bill. Steve is also the author of The Obligation, a journey to discover human purpose on Earth and in the cosmos. Steve, welcome to your first visit. I'm glad you've been here all day. The screen is yours.
So much, Lee, and thank you, Tim, and everyone. Great program so far. Really, congratulations. And I've certainly been tracking what the Foundation for the Future has been doing, and so much energy, so much enthusiasm. So hats off to you guys. This conversation today is really exciting about how we're financing space, right? Laura kind of teed it up really nicely with all of the amount of money that's pouring into this market right now, $14.5 billion. And growing, right? 50%. If we go 50% year over year, there's going to be quite a huge amount of capital coming in. And I think what I'm trying to do with this project that the Beyond Earth Institute is looking into, is saying, okay, that's great, but how do we then leverage what's emerging as sort of a tide into sort of more of a tidal wave? How could we really drive this investment ultimately to creating a very large scale, to enable large scale infrastructure investment, leading ultimately to communities living beyond Earth? I mean, I think a number of us, if not everyone on this call, is very interested in this future where humankind is moving beyond this Earth. We're becoming a multiplanetary species, and we're kind of embracing that as a philosophical meme, if you will. And so all of us are focused on how do we get to there from where we are from this point. And so much of the activity is around how do we do it technologically, but really one of the hardest bits is how do we do that financially. So we're going from $14.5 billion invested last year, but we're really talking about many tens of billions of dollars into the hundreds of billions of dollars of the kind of investment that are needed in terms of having a robust civilization of sorts around the moon, around Mars, in free space, and so forth. So how do we get from here to there? And I think that's what I want to dig into. And I know I only have a few minutes. I've got way too many slides, so I apologize for that. I'm going to try to make it not seem like I'm rushing, and you'll have to cut me off as well. So I'm going to actually set my timer here too. So I try to keep this going. I'm sharing. You guys could see my screen now.
Yep, you are not in presentation mode yet.
I am looking. All right, so I'm going to presentation mode here. 1 second. All right. So yeah, I'm really going to talk about a Beyond Earth study, financing communities beyond Earth. Happy to be here again. Just a second on Beyond Earth Institute, who we are. We are a think tank, a policy think tank. Our mission is to establish and sustain a policy and legal framework that enables economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. So we're distinguishing ourselves in that way. We're focusing on areas including what are declarations that could be made about establishing communities beyond Earth as a national and international goal. We're very interested in the science and technology that enable this kind of future and how do we create policies around that. We're interested in rule of law, norms of behavior, property usage rights, permitting criteria, those sorts of things. And ultimately, this last bullet is about how do we create policies that are most effective at enabling the financing for this kind of activity. So in this particular project, we did a review. We wanted to take a step back, do a review of the historical and current financing mechanisms for large-scale infrastructure investments, both in space and just in general. Then we reviewed and evaluated a series, 3 select proposed models. One of those was Tim Christman's, your model. We wanted, it was important that these models were well conceived and well thought out. We did a workshop on each one of these. We had a group of evaluators, and I'll list them for you in a minute. And they did sort of a qualitative review and a quantitative review. We had them answer a survey, and I'm going to share the survey responses to you. So this is actually, you'll see this for the first time, Tim, and it should be interesting. So very briefly, financing of large scale space development, what does it mean? What are the approaches? It's really 3 things. One is direct government financing, right? And we know this, the government can inject funding to help to create an economy, certainly a space economy. We've been doing that from Apollo through the ISS and so forth. So, we're really looking at the science and exploration aspect of it. Certainly national security is pumping direct government financing, But we know that these kinds of activities are not sustainable, right? So we know that as soon as there's a change in national policy, as what happened after Apollo, all of that effort now was put on hold, was sidelined, because there wasn't a robust commercial economy surrounding this activity. And hopefully now we're actually transitioning to something different. Of course, now there's a public, then there's a private investment. So if you're going exclusively private, there's debt capital, equity capital, private equity, venture capital, donations. These are various ways that you could collect capital in order to finance your space activities. And we see a lot of this going on right now. And certainly, of course, a lot of talk about SPACs. SPACs came on very strongly. We know there's a little bit of a retreat on using this, but it's certainly not going away as a mechanism for raising significant amounts of cash to fund private space activities. But then, of course, we're recognizing that really it's this partnership, right, between the public and the private, and coming up with a creative mechanism whereby we're working together to stimulate a certain kind of direction in where we want to go in space, right? So historically, we are familiar with things like the Transcontinental Railroad, the Tennessee Valley Authority. I like Sematech. A lot of you might not be familiar with that, but that was in the 80s. Japan was eating our lunch in microprocessors, and the government with industry put together Sematech, and we did a crash course in reviving the American Sematech industry, and it was very successful. PPP for NASA, those of you who follow this are very familiar with, after decades of cost plus financing of projects, NASA finally dipped its toe in the water for partnering with commercial companies through the COTS program, which ultimately was extremely successful. For scant $800 million, they developed 2 new launch systems and 2 automatic cargo spacecraft. It was successful, and they're certainly continuing this process through the CLIPS program, the Viper program, the Artemis human lander system, and of course the very recently announced the commercial LEO destination program. So NASA, and as mentioned, the DoD as well, are recognizing that, why do we need to build something when we can buy it off the shelf, when there are willing and able commercial partners in the market that are willing to partner with us. So other government incentives that can be utilized to help to stimulate space activity, loan to debt guarantee, loan or debt guarantees, low interest loans, tax incentives. There's zero tax for GRG is a common refrain among space advocates, certainly cash subsidies, so these kinds of things. But I would say that these kinds of mechanisms would be packaged, right? So they may have value as standalone to stimulate one way or another, but probably better to be packaged in an overall program. So really, how are we finding the right finance models for large scale infrastructure and habitat projects? That's really what the Beyond Earth Institute is really trying to grapple with. We're not trying to come up with an absolute answer. And what I thought, now I'm going to share with you the organizations that we've been taking a close look at. And one thing's interesting is that all of these groups, Tim included, were saying, hey, listen, I'm not saying that we have all the answers. We're putting something down on paper, and we're asking people to engage in this conversation. And that's really what's so exciting about this. And even as you see this, some of the guys kind of were communicating with each other about how they might work together. So these are not competing ideas. These are just ideas that are out there that are getting us to think. Ultimately, how will these plans be structured and so forth? That's yet to be determined, but we think that is a direction we have to go. We held 3 workshops last summer. And let me just get into this. These are our evaluators. You may recognize some of these folks that have been involved in financing and investment and so forth. And then let me just get to it. We asked our evaluators to look at each one of these proposals or models along these various criteria for comprehensiveness and completeness, chances of success, financial soundness, diversity, and enabling communities beyond Earth. So let's get to it. I think we're going to start with the Lunar Development Cooperative. I am not going to do these plans justice in a few minutes, but I just want to give you an overview. And if you come to our website, or if you certainly reach out to me, I could share with you more information on these. But the Lunar Development Cooperative would be an organization that finances and delivers affordable public services through location-based service access fees to public and private entities developing facilities and habitats on the moon. The way I like to think of LDC is this is a turnkey municipality on the moon, where they are going to provide everything that you need to construct a facility on the moon for your purposes, whether it's for government purposes, private purposes, or manufacturing, or tourism, whatever it might be. So it is public-private organization. Shares would be publicly traded. The government ownership, according to their plan, would be limited to 49%. So they feel that it's better not to have government have control over this. They feel that their governance is strong in keeping this from becoming corrupt, if you will, through a board of directors, board of advisors, and an inspector general. The LDC collects usage fees for services provided and infrastructure provided. Now I can't see. Oops. I'm sorry. The infrastructure provided includes increases overall value to the investors and participants. This is a list of services. So it ranges from power, water, trading post, insurance, regulatory oversight, security, healthcare. Think of your town or city and think of all the services that you could get through the city, and they potentially could be provided at. So I like this model in that it's kind of all inclusive in that regard. Now, let me see. Now comes the evaluation. So I will say that I think our evaluators were a very conservative lot. And it was a small sampling of evaluators too. It might change if we had a larger sample. However, we have a score for comprehensiveness and completeness. And there were a number, under each one of these categories, there were a number of questions. So, but just in the interest of just sort of putting this aggregate information up, I just thought I'd share this with you. So you see these mostly in the mid-range. They got high, and this is on a scale from 1 to 10, so they're mostly in the mid-range. Clarity was a little bit better, and certainly they got points for diversity. So now let's look at the Space Corporation Act. This is Tim's group. Now, Tim, I'm sure I'm not going to do this justice, so I apologize in advance. But the Space Corporation Act, or the Space Public-Private Advanced Commercialization Enterprise Corporation Act, is proposed to be introduced in Congress by the Foundation for the Future. If passed, the corporation would establish in the United States a federally chartered infrastructure development corporation for space activities, okay, in a nutshell. So they're US chartered public-private corporation. They're publicly traded on a model after ComStat, according to their literature. Government ownership is a minimum of 51%. So interestingly, they're taking the position that actually we want the government to have ultimate control versus the prior plan. It has authority to allocate funds through grants, space bonds, and space commercial development loans, and similar to SBI loans and so forth. And they, according to their research, they would generate $150 billion in new economic activity. I think of the Space Corporation Act as a place that is, I would say, a little bit more market driven, right? In terms of what are we seeing holistically are the needs to build out the space economy. Is probably also is more better in terms of the incremental approach, right? So we're at a particular stage right now in terms of building out the space economy or the cislunar economy. So this would actually work to sort of evolve as the markets evolve. Examples of space-based activities that have immediate commercial activity potential. Tapping into clean energy resources. I would imagine that includes space solar power, mining of asteroids, developing safe venues for scientific experiments. I guess we could talk about shirt sleeve habitats in orbit, tapping the resources of water on the moon and asteroids and so forth. So there are clearly well-defined areas here. I know I'm running out of time, so we're almost there. The evaluators were a little bit similar to the to the cooperative idea in terms of their overall evaluation in the mid ranges, but it gets high points for clarity. So that's important. Bank of Space, which is another interesting concept, and it varies significantly. And now we've got actually I'm going to share the infographic that they have. This is a traditional, or I should say, a neo bank. So people would invest and make deposits into this bank, knowing that this bank is going to take a portion of that money and invest it in space projects. So it's ideal for people who want to, make a financial contribution to space, but don't want to necessarily put their money at risk. So it has all the FDIC controls and so forth. And over time, as the assets of this bank built up over time, greater and greater amounts of money would be made available for developing infrastructure and ultimately habitats in space. FDIC insured. People can invest. They're looking for initial capitalization of $50 million. Not that much. Overall, it would have a national bank charter regulated by the OCC. It's all digital, and it would gradually increase the higher and higher risk and so forth. So this is kind of more concise, more traditional, different from this. Basically, totally letting the market to a degree dictate where this money is flowing. And so this, in terms of the evaluation, they actually overall got higher marks than the other two plans. I think that might have something to do with the clarity. Certainly, they have very pretty slides, so I think in terms of clarity that helps. And overall, it was complete. Chances of success were a little bit higher. Financial soundness was pretty high, and diversity was okay, and clarity was very good. And so this is, these are, this is kind of the beginning. And I'm going to stop sharing. Here's my contact information, though. Please do steve@beyondearth.org. Please feel free to reach out to me, anytime on this. We are looking for other people to engage in this activity, in this project, and this really is just the start. I think we need to continue to ask this question and to come up with recommendations that can be put forward.
It's really fascinating, Steve. Yeah, really interesting way of going about the project.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about, were there other mechanisms that you chose not to include in this round? Or was it difficult to find the ones that you did, and you're not seeing a lot of opportunities?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Actually, I kind of had my ear out and was eager to find additional models. And I was just coincident. Like I said, I had my ear out and I spotted these three. And then I thought that the others would have materialized. And to be honest, I haven't really seen them.
Yeah.
I would like to see more. So certainly if people are familiar with, again, all three of these models, a lot of energy, a lot of consideration went into thinking all of the aspects through. So that's what we're keen on. And also to, next phase of this would be involved in getting the financial folks together, getting different folks together, and brainstorming this and where can this go?
Yeah. Yeah, I thought your opening where you talked about hundreds of billions was something that more people need to be talking about, right? I mean, when you think about comparing aerospace to oil and gas and just the sheer amount of investment in R&D and activity and infrastructure, you learn a lot when you invest those kinds of dollars, and space just hasn't had that opportunity. So, a good point to make.
Yeah, no, and I mean that's a challenge because there's literally nothing there yet, and so you're looking to, folks just aren't going to put that kind of money. And I think but on the other hand, as soon as there's some kind of proof of concept with the cooperation of nation states, could be the United States or could be a combination of nation states that recognize that this is a direction that humanity needs to take for a lot of reasons. Then we could, once we have that proof of concept, then I think that kind of funding will start to open up.
Yeah. What did you mean by diversity in this scoring?
Diversity in the sense of diversity in terms of gender, race, inclusion, with regards to in that sense. And I think some of it, it was an interesting addition that came up as we were sort of talking about this. And obviously diversity is an important dimension of everything, and obviously you want space to be open and equitable for everyone who's interested in going. So
Yeah, I didn't see anything in the proposal descriptions that would allow someone to make an assessment of that metric.
Yeah, and that gets to the amount of time that I had. I had to cut corners somewhere, and
Yeah.
I think in the Space Development Cooperative had very specific language.
I see.
So they got sort of more points for that, and again, it was up to the evaluators to determine how they assess that. So it was a challenging question for sure.
Yeah, and people need to be interested in order to become engaged, and that's sometimes a limitation as well. You didn't mention trash collection in LDS, I noticed, but that was good. Why limit to 49%? You mentioned concerns about corruption, but it's interesting, the Space Corporation Act, at least 51%, LDS less than 49. Why the difference there?
No, I love that, and and actually I didn't really. I only noticed that in putting together these slides for this call, that really popped up to me. That really hadn't popped up to me before, because clearly there's a slightly different mindset, right? So and this is something that you probably could spend a fair amount of time debating, and maybe people on this call have opinions as well. Do you want, is it really government that should have the ultimate say? Or should it be? Should it ultimately be the private investors who could be large companies, but also could be small investors, could be different types, could be tenants, could be, people who have a different stake in the activity, and maybe both are appropriate for their respective models, right? So Tim's model under the corporation model, maybe it is better that government has 1% control, and under the LDC model, which is much more of a township type of model, maybe that's where you want you want non-government to have a slightly more control. So it's just I just think it's interesting.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Now, your focus is on these large scale communities and getting there and sort of mapping out what those would look like. And you're leaving the initial small communities that will come first and perhaps for a long time to other organizations and experts, right? Talk about that decision and how tempting it was to um, not skip over that and say, well, if we can only get this little thing done, then we'll get to hundreds of millions and we'll get to these major services. But like, talk about that decision.
Well, I think part of that has to do with recognizing that there's so much energy right now in the sort of the near term stuff. But I will, so there isn't any policy think tank that's saying, okay, that's all fantastic. So let's look at the longer term policies. That said, however, we're very interested in any policy that would enable more people to experience space, right? So, for example, we're very interested in what's going on right now with the commercial LEO destination program at NASA, and we want to make sure that that's fully funded and that's up and running. So there's certain things that are enabling, right? So there's a certain pathway that leads to these larger and larger habitats. And we like to look at this as the expansion of the space is a bit of a numbers game, which is how many people are in space right now and how do you increase those numbers? So as those numbers increase, we'll get closer and closer to that end result. So it's not just whereas this project on models for large scale infrastructure and habitat, like I just discussed, it might be lean a little bit more towards the academic side of the discussion, right? So, but if we're having that discussion now, when the time comes when we're really going to make that kind of investment, we'll have a body of knowledge to turn to. So that's one part of our thing, and then the other part is to look at what's happening now and how do we enhance and support drive, if you will, near-term policy as well. And it might have to do with in terms of, are we doing the right kind of research? How can we support greater research in certain areas and life support capabilities, space farming, and that kind of thing, which has near-term benefit, but it's also on the critical path to space settlement.
Great. Well, Steve, thank you for joining us and enlightening us and including Foundation for the Future's Space Corporation Act in your program.
Great. Thank you. Thanks again.
All right. Our next speaker is Doug Jarl. He has execution responsibility for the aerospace, defense, and government services vertical, having joined Barclays in August 2018. Prior to joining them, Doug spent 5 years in investment banking at Bank of America. Doug has broad industry transaction experience spanning sell-side and buy-side M&A, equity capital markets, leveraged finance, and investment-grade debt capital markets. Maybe you'll be able to answer some of Laura's questions from earlier today. Prior to investment banking, Doug served in the United States Navy as a nuclear submarine officer stationed aboard the USS Toledo, SSN 769. I was born in Toledo. Doug graduated from the United States Naval Academy with a Bachelor of Science in Systems Engineering in 2007 and received an MBA degree from Duke University's Fuqua School of Business in 2013. When I introduced Ron the first time, I went to North Carolina, so, I have a little bit of trouble just putting that passion behind the Duke introduction. So my apologies there, but we got Toledo and we have the U.S. Naval Academy. I lived across the street from that for a little while as a child. So take it away, and the screen is yours.
Thanks, Lee. No, that's great. Yeah, two out of three works. So I think we're all good there. Yeah, no, thank you again for that introduction. Look, I appreciate I'm honored to be here and to speak today. So I don't have any slides to present, but I know I got about say 15 or 20 minutes. Haven't rehearsed how long this will go, but so if I ramble on, just cut me off and we can go from there. But yeah, no, as you mentioned, the focus of this is, how do you look at space offerings, space investments from an investment banking perspective? So that's kind of how I'm going to form the little presentation here. I'm just going to hit on kind of 5 mini topics, if that works. Go through those, and then however you want to run it after that, or Q&A, we'll go with that. But yeah, so from my perspective, right, as I cover aerospace and defense, space is a natural extension of that. Falls today both in the commercial and the defense world. And so, to me, it's a very exciting part of A&D. It's a new extension with all these new technologies, which is really fascinating and exciting today. So when we look at it, when an investment banker looks at it, when I look at the space, we look at it first from how we can help, and meaning what products we offer, how can that work? So number one would be M&A advisory. So we'll look at it from that angle. The second one would be equity capital markets. So it would be either from an IPO or a de-SPAC, or from a private capital raise perspective. And then the third one would be from a debt lens. And so as space is today, the age of the sector, debt is probably less so. And if I were to rank, I think we can all agree that de-SPAC, although it may not be the best word today, de-SPACs have been very popular, obviously, over the past year, as well as private capital. And private capital, I think, tends to be still the number one means of growing space investments today. M&A, as I'll go into in a little bit, is I think it's tougher from my perspective, from a Barclays perspective, from a bulge bracket perspective, just given the stage of where these companies are, where they're pre-revenue sometimes, they don't have a lot of EBITDA. So it makes it a little tougher to do M&A today, even though it is getting done, as we've seen from some of these new space companies. So that's how we look at it. So the second thing would be coverage of the space, just given coverage from a knowledge and a technology perspective. And what's interesting, what's 2 parts, what makes it difficult to cover, as well as what makes it exciting, is all the new technology. All the new technology from all these startup companies, as well as mature companies. And the number one thing is trying to get your head around that, trying to understand what the business model is, trying to deduce whether this has legs, whether there's strategic partnerships, will it be successful both in the commercial and defense, or one or the other. So from that perspective, thankfully, having an engineering background and being on a sub makes it a little easier to understand. Although part of the thing going to the conferences, is helpful in the fact that you get to talk to the actual engineers of some of these companies, really learn what they are producing. So that's helpful. I think the second part is financials, right? So as I've been hitting on, these companies are much smaller, and they're private, obviously. So it's hard to discern the actual size of some of the companies, and really, kind of sift out which ones are going to succeed, which ones aren't going to succeed. And obviously there's no magic formula to that. So that's another part. And then the last part I'd hit on kind of goes with that is, for PE clients, they tend to be, some of them tend to be interested in space. I mean, most all of them have an interest in space, but I think it gets difficult from the mandates from the funds that they've raised, because obviously they're looking for at least a little bit of EBITDA. So again, that's kind of where the challenge is from my perspective, trying to generate business on my end, is that there aren't a ton of targets with the correct or the right parameters to do M&A deals, as I mentioned before. The third topic, though, is kind of pockets of opportunity. So kind of covering the sector to now where we feel there are pockets of opportunity, in our opinion. And so staying on the PE trend is platform plays, right? So we've seen successful platform plays from the likes of AE Industrial Partners, where they took Redwire before it was Redwire, and they started piecing together some of these smaller space companies that had, call it single-digit EBITDA. Created a platform. They created it at such a time where the de-SPAC market was still pretty attractive, and so they de-SPAC, become Redwire, and become a very good name in the new space environment. So that one, ATL Partners acquiring Geost, is another one where they're looking to make a platform play. And then you have InnoFlight that was acquired by Jordan. That one's interesting. A little tangential to when my partner and I advised on Seeker in the fall. It's kind of a competitor to Seeker. And then the last one, Arlington Capital, maybe stretch is a little strong word, but creating Blue Halo, which is more of a defense as well as a space company, which is a very unique up and coming company. And Arlington Capital Partners is doing a very good job at building that out. So that's platform plays. The second one would be, as we've mentioned, de-SPACs, IPOs. Again, caveat at the moment, the market is what it is. It's not super attractive for anything right now. But for de-SPACs in particular, it's a little challenging. Last year seemed to have been the year, 10 plus de-SPACs for space companies, and then mixed receptivity as they've closed and become actual public companies today. We can help from that perspective, as well as the pipes that are involved with de-SPACs. And that's a helpful way to see how investors are looking at space companies. So we help with that as well. I think the trend has been, though, as we've gone over 2020 and 21 really, is that across all the new technologies between drones, eVTOLs, and space in particular, investors have become smarter and they've become a little more risk adverse, and they really want to be sure what they're buying into, especially if it's a pre-revenue company. So we have to be extra diligent when we're advising companies to really kind of dig in, see do they have good pipeline opportunities. It tends to be a lot of defense funding to start, even if they have a commercial strategy in the long term. So a lot of the funding for these companies comes from the defense, and then they transition over time through their projections, as you can see the kind of the hockey stick projections for some of the companies. And what's still popular is the last thing is private capital, right? So there's a lot of private capital raises, that are still going on and sizable today, a couple $100 million here and there. And then an astonishing one by Sierra Space, $1 billion raise, which was phenomenal. So that is, today, if you're a company evaluating your capital needs, it makes the most sense to try and raise privately, continue your growth privately, and then potentially find a monetization event, whether it's a de-SPAC or an IPO, after we get kind of out of this choppy market. So that's kind of the third mini topic. Well, I guess I should hit on the debt markets, right? So, which is not a big topic, but it's, as you've seen with some of these new space companies that have de-SPACed, apart from just equity raises, which are probably the most common option, and at the top of the list, you can think of the convertible debt market, which is another alternative to just raising equity. And so that we've had some recent conversations with some top de-SPAC names on this, and it comes after kind of lockups are over and so forth. And so that's one. The question also comes from time to time, are there any other options? And again, it goes back to EBITDA, cash flow generation. It's very tough, even at least from an institutional perspective, from a bulge bracket perspective, to do any leverage finance on these names today, just given there's tends to be very little EBITDA and cash flow generation, although that's not to say there aren't other sources out there, right? There are other sources that kind of float in between, equity raise on the venture side, as well as what institutional banks can help with. So I'm sure there's another market there, which I'm not the expert on, so I won't go in depth there. And then kind of the last thing I wanted to hit on is my last mini topic is, I guess we'll call it current events. It's more of investor sentiment, as well as kind of, I think the one that's topical is the recent report that came out, State of Competition in the defense industrial base, which I think is important to note here for space. But just first off, for investor sentiment, as you look at some of the de-SPAC names, these are, typically the investor sentiment topic typically applies to the public names, or as companies decide to go public. I mean, we've seen from some of the new space names that have had either Russian ownership or other foreign ownership, which obviously from a national security perspective may not be the most attractive. So, but I think on the positive side, those situations have been resolved, and these companies look to grow from where they are after they solve the issue, which is a fantastic thing for the entire space industry, in my opinion. We've seen one recently where, and I think this goes with all de-SPACs, right? And this would be kind of overstating projections or making potential misstatements in your growth or your timeline. And unfortunately, there can be some lawsuits that come of that. And I think that's just kind of the unfortunate nature of the beast when you are allowed to put projections in your statements for instance a de-SPAC, which is another topic we can go into at a different point at appropriate time. But so those are kind of, I guess maybe more negative, but there are some positive things that come out of there. And then the positive thing to hit on my current event section here is this recent, it kind of was stemming from the Lockheed Aerojet termination, this report actually from, I believe it's Office of the President and not the DoD, which makes it sort of interesting, but also positive at the same time, is what they're calling a state of competition in the defense industrial base. And so I think one of the points they're hitting on, apart from the obvious scrutiny amongst mergers and consolidation in the industry, is promoting the small businesses, which to me that reads everything in space, right? venture companies, small companies looking to grow, to increase competition. I think, to me, that's what new space is all about. It's about creating these companies that are kind of changing the way that traditional primes or larger conglomerates have faced this. And we've seen it with, the DoD has partaken in this with, SDA and so forth, kind of having a mission statement of not looking for the 100% solution, but finding the 80% solution that can get to market faster. And I think the phrase sometimes is fail fast and then kind of correct yourself, course correct, and you come to a solution that's not 10 years down the road, but is effective today, because we can probably all agree that national security today is kind of utmost important, I believe. And so, again, the last thing I'll say for that defense industrial base is that they hit on 5 key sectors that they're really focused on. They don't specifically call out space, but they call out things such as hypersonics, which is, essentially space, right? There's a lot to do with how you create missile defense systems, how you create hypersonics, and so forth, that has to do with space. And so, again, I think that is a very positive thing for the industry in general. So those are kind of my 5 mini topics. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So one question is, how is investment bank investing? How does that differ from VCs? So, I mean, for most of the space sector, most of those investments are in the form of a venture raise. And so, maybe the handing over of the check is the same, but what is it that's different on everything else?
Yeah, so from my perspective, and I tend to be candid sometimes, is that we don't have skin in the game. And I think that's sometimes unfortunate, that I feel it's unfortunate. But so if you think about it, the difference for us is that we are transactional based, right? So when I listed off the products such as M&A, equity capital markets, and debt, we help execute those transactions, right? And so for M&A, we receive a fee on whether we're on the buy side or the sell side. So we are with our client from the start to the finish. But at the end of the day, how we get paid is we get paid an advisory fee. So like I said, unfortunately, because I like space, we don't actually put dollars to work in an M&A transaction. Equity capital markets is very similar, right? So we are the conduits, wherever we sit on the deal, we are the conduits. If you're the pipe placement agent, if you're a SPAC advisor, or if you're the target advisor, it's unique in nature because both sides come together, both advisory sides come together because they all become one team because they want it to be successful. But we are going out to the investors, whether it be additional VC money, but you tend to see when it becomes a de-SPAC, you see a lot of institutional, right? You'll see a lot of BlackRock, you'll see Fidelity, T. Rose, that are putting a lot of that institutional money. And again, at the end of the day, we get a fee for our service. And the same thing goes with debt. We'll take some, this is the one thing where it differs, and it's more in leverage finance and really in leverage finances. We'll syndicate out. So we'll have a smaller hold and we'll syndicate out the rest of the loan. So it depends on how much we want to hold on our balance sheet. But that's, I guess, to answer your question in a long way, is that's when we'll put our dollars to work, is on the debt side.
Okay. So otherwise you're more or less brokering the deal and being that trusted agent between the parties.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're, as that intermediary, and what are you seeing as some of the major hurdles for more and or larger investments from those bigger PE firms?
For PE firms specifically, it's really it's really having that EBITDA and that cash flow to make the returns work. Because you'll see, I don't know if you call it like maybe traditional firms, I would say probably traditional funds, they have a mandate, right? And it's, you have to fit it within this box, right? And it's usually an IRR of 20% plus or minus, you have a return of so forth. And then, you have a hold period of, 3 to 5 years, right? The standard PE investment. What you've seen some of the traditional PE firms, which I mentioned earlier, is that, and I think this goes across any sector, is they're creating alternative funds. They're raising other funds and other capital for funds that are created for either middle market opportunities or maybe we'll call it frontier opportunities, which is, electric vehicles, space, what have you on a technology front. And that will have the mandate to perhaps put an equity investment in a kind of a VC startup company. And you'll see with AE Industrial Partners how they partnered or they bought, don't quote me, part of Boeing Next, I believe. And so that's kind of the VC arm out of Boeing. And so, right, that was just a big public signal that they were doing this already, but they kind of just made it public, even more public, that they would have that in their toolkit as well as putting investment dollars in smaller space companies.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. No, it's fascinating to hear sort of the calculus on all these different sides, even just of the equity raising and what goes into that. And so that was really informative. So thanks for taking the time to chat with us today, Doug.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to do it. Thanks again for the invite. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, gladly. So we are going to take a quick 5-minute stretch break since we've heard from prior attendees that they don't like sitting in front of a computer for 4 hours straight. It's very strange. So we're gonna run our little 5-minute stretch, come back, and we'll hear from Burkett Huey from Morningstar. So stay with us until then.
All right. I hope everyone had a nice little break. Got a chance to breathe and stretch legs. It was a good idea. Our next speaker is Burkett Huey. He is an equity analyst on the industrials team for Morningstar Research Services LLC, a wholly owned subsidiary of Morningstar Inc. He covers aerospace and defense as well as airlines, which I thought were part of aerospace. Prior to his current role, he was an equity analyst for the financial services team for Morningstar Research Services LLC and assisted in the coverage of REIT and banking companies. Huey holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Colorado College. He also holds the Chartered Financial Analyst designation. Burkett, thanks for being with us today. We're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts.
Great. Well, the screen is yours, and I'm excited to hear sort of about what Morningstar does. I've always known about the mutual fund analysis and scoring. Have always used those since I was about maybe 10 years old. I remember looking at those. So tell us about this particular wholly owned subsidiary, how it came to be, and what do you do?
Yeah, so Morningstar is maybe best known for its mutual fund ratings, but it provides a pretty diversified suite of ratings for equity, equities, debt, mutual funds, of course, and also acts as an asset manager in a separate capacity for for a variety of financial advisors, as well as 401k plans and others. So within my group, I cover aerospace and defense. My primary focus is on Boeing and Airbus. Lockheed Martin are probably some of the highest, the most visible names, but I cover the aerospace suppliers, the airlines, which do actually have their own separate group in the S&P 500. I have visibility into pretty much the full value chain for aerospace and defense, and tangential exposure to following the commercialization of space, primarily through the defense prime contractors.
Yeah, okay. So the Lockheeds, the Northrops, you're really seeing into that world. How much of your focus, given that you've got that entire value chain and now there's this like ringing noise coming from commercial space, how much attention does that get in your day, your week, your month, now that it's kind of this special thing going on?
Well, I would say that it's definitely something that's been kept in mind. I'd say that the difficulty on my end to understand these companies is that first, Morningstar's methodology for rating stocks is pretty old school. We project out cash flows, discount it back to the present, and I would say that the projecting cash flows for companies that many of which may be pre-revenue is a little bit tough, and dependent on the development of a market. I guess what I would say is that I've definitely paid attention to these companies as they are partnering up with maybe some of the larger defense primes to enhance capabilities, and I see that kind of as a way for larger players to perhaps integrate some of the innovations that maybe more startup-y type companies might be putting into their business model.
Yeah, so a nimbleness through acquisition, maybe an Orbit Fab into Lockheed kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the right way to think about a lot of these companies, at least and I mean, this is pretty very early stage. So, definitely not the definitive word on this, but I think the right way to think about a lot of these, pre-revenue companies and their relationship with the defense primes is almost like that of a drug manufacturer and the emerging biotechs and emerging drugs. It's really kind of tough to see at that early stage what the ultimate value of these target companies are and what the ultimate value of these IPs are, because either the product works and there is some value to it, or the product doesn't work and there is no value to it. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult as an investor on the outside to really have to see that, particularly if you don't like myself, I don't have specialized engineering experience. I'm a financial analyst. Yeah. So I guess I kind of view this as I view many of these companies as startup-y, the most similar kind of thing, I guess, is the relationship between biotechs and drug manufacturers, in that there's definitely an innovation pipeline out there getting developed. Perhaps it may get acquired, perhaps not. I was very interested to see that report from the President's Office about mergers and acquisitions within the defense space yesterday. I don't think they touched too much on the relationship between the defense primes and emerging technology. I think it was focused on more prime to prime and prime to sub-supplier. But I guess that's kind of how I've been thinking about things.
Yeah, really interesting. Given the willingness to engage with these pre-revenue companies, are people friendly to just changing their expectations of what we should be looking at when we're investing? Sort of like in the real estate bubble or tech bubble back in the day. Talk a little bit about some more parallels there, and whether, how careful we should be in allowing this flexibility in looking at investments.
Well, I mean, when I try to think about things, that valuing something with that's uncertain, I try to bring it back to the progression of free cash flow, mm-hmm. and how sure you can be in projecting it. Yeah. And a critical component of that is, maybe if you're not super certain about what the projection of free cash flow is, if the discount rate at which you're bringing back that free cash to the present is super low, as it was definitely in 2020 and for much of 2021, it doesn't really matter quite so much if you can't project things out. But as we're seeing 10-year yields rise, I think that the opportunity cost for holding risky assets is increasing, and I mean, you can see that in the U.S. 10-year yield. I mean, it's what, doubled in the last 6 months. I think. So, I guess that now I think that if there is IP out there, and I think that some of the engineers of the primes would probably be some of the best suited to determining what the value of this intellectual property actually is. Perhaps there's going to be an opportunity for partnerships at very nice valuations. Yeah. But ultimately, you're going to have to. But to do that, you have to have an opinion on what the underlying value of the intellectual property is. And as of right now, I certainly have a very tough time doing that. Yeah. And I'd imagine, and at least looking at the valuations of some of the de-SPACed companies, it looks like many others and many other investors are looking at that as well. I don't cover directly into the emerging space companies, but I certainly do follow their stocks, tangentially as they relate to my coverage.
Yeah, so let's back up a little bit. Great answer on the changing interest rates, and the time horizon is really interesting. Go back a little bit to the nuts and bolts of your process for assessing space companies and the ratings, and then talk about, I guess, speaking of markets, talk about who uses them.
Yeah. So, I like I said, I don't directly cover any of the space companies, but I'm happy to talk about aerospace, and I think it's probably going to end up pretty similar for space.
Yeah.
I guess I was thinking about this last night. I think the defining characteristic of the industry is just the massive research and development cost required to create a product. And I think from that, there stems a lot of different sub-factors within the industry. One of which is that it's really tough for competitors to replicate products once they're there. And frequently what you'll see with suppliers to aerospace products is that even if a product could be replicated, even if some widget on a plane could be replicated, it's really tough to change the design of a plane to fit this new widget, and the cost savings on that would be pretty minimal. So once you're in, it's really tough to unseat a company with a platform. So really, I think a lot of projections are based on supply and demand rather than competition among participants. I'd say a second factor is that because these products are pretty expensive, customers tend to be a bit, I'm not sure if price sensitive is the right way to put it, but I certainly would, I think that I don't think it's that astonishing to say that the reduction in price of launch services is probably a big driver of the increased demand for small satellites, and opening up. It makes some of these new use cases a little bit more affordable, and it makes some of these use cases make sense a little bit more than maybe it did in the 2000s. I'd say another defining characteristic of the industry is just the difficulty of customers to switch from supplier to supplier once they've integrated with a particular system, simply just because these products are so complicated and it takes a lot of training, and usually these products last years, if not decades. So it can be a little bit tough. It can be a little bit tough to. I guess that breeds kind of a conservative customer base, because when it's different than buying a candy bar in the grocery store. If you don't like it, the next day you can just go get a different kind. You can't get a new engine on an aircraft tomorrow if you don't like it.
You could call it supplier plasticity and say it's low, right?
At Morningstar, so I guess what I was trying to get at is two what we call moat sources. So we call that a switching cost. So we think that the customers have pretty high switching costs, particularly for in the engine space, because you can't change your engine on most aircraft, so you're kind of captive to the engine maker on prices for things such as spare parts, maintenance and overhaul. There are some fringe cases, but for most of the time, customers are really reluctant to switch.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it's good news for investors in suppliers, right? It's a lot of predictability in that market.
On the demand side, in normal times, yes, that definitely is a good provider of predictability. I would say one of the big factors of unpredictability is that research and development costs, like we were talking about at the first point. You know, it's. I think I was seeing an old article on what Boeing thought the 787 was going to cost to develop back in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And I think it ended up being, 3 or 4 times that, three and a half times what they originally expected. So, that's a pretty big difference on multi-billion-dollar development programs. So that's going to be a big swing factor in operating results. And how long does it take to capitalize those development costs is a big factor.
Yeah. When Ron Epstein was here the first time back in November, I don't know if you saw his talk today, but he talked about the fact that with space R&D, it's not typical R&D because it typically is government funded through a contract. There may have been some of that with 787, but the Starliner for sure was heavily subsidized R&D, and he saw that as a different kind of category. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So that's pretty analogous to what you see at a lot of the defense primes.
Yeah.
You see that with the F-35. You see that with a lot of development programs there. Traditionally, a lot of the R&D is sponsored by the government, and because of that, they're able to negotiate lower prices and kind of specialty deals with that. So I would say that the difference between commercial R&D and defense R&D is whoever pays for the intellectual property gets the intellectual property. And frequently, like for instance on the engine side, that's pretty much all private in most cases. You'll see that and because of that, you see pretty high margins on the aftermarket or spare parts, whereas on the military side of engines, since the government pays for a lot of that research and development, you really don't have any difference in margins between the original equipment and the aftermarket.
Interesting. Talk about where Morningstar is headed next in terms of the role there. Is it status quo or is there growth, and what do you see happening?
As it relates to the aerospace space, or
Yeah, so the subsidiary, the Morningstar Research Services, do you think there'll be any changes in how you go about the work in the next 2 to 5 years?
I think that the way that we've been thinking about at least the aerospace industry is that as emerging nations become wealthier, they tend to demand a more travel. And so I guess we kind of see that there's a bit of a long tail of populous nations that can develop into populous, lower income nations that can develop into lower middle income and middle income nations. I'd say
Next 11, all those guys, you're seeing that as
exactly. And since there's there's 2 suppliers for commercial aircraft, and very few and very limited suppliers. This is a global industry. All of that global development essentially flows to the main suppliers of commercial aircraft. So I guess that's kind of the way that I think about the long-term trajectory of growth. It's a function populous emerging markets developing.
Yeah. No, that's a really good insight, because you think about this. We were talking about government R&D, and then we look at our national debt and all this pandemic economic policy, and you worry a little bit. So, talk about the overall health right now of the industry versus 3 years ago and 3 years hence.
Well, it's a tough question. I'd say
Yeah.
I would say that the pandemic definitely had a pretty major impact across the board, aside from your pure play defense suppliers. And so what that means for most carriers, most airlines, and most suppliers is that they took on a good bit of debt to survive periods of low cash flow, while still working to invest in the future. That's it varies between industry participants, but so I'd say the story over the next 3 years for a lot of airlines, certainly Boeing, certainly many suppliers, is working to delever their balance sheet, with incremental growth in the industry. So I think that's probably going to be a big part of the story.
Yeah. So when you specifically mentioned Boeing, major delays on multiple projects, issues, public, public disgrace in some ways of their processes and procedures, that has borne out, even though it's separated from the space part of their business, in some of the accomplishments there. Obviously a wonderful company over the years. Talk about how that has affected the balance. There are so few airline suppliers, commercial airline suppliers. Can you talk a little bit about how that has changed that dynamic and where you see that going?
Yeah, so I would say that Boeing is a story unto itself. I could talk about that for another half hour if you'd like, but I'd say that really the key parts of the story in the near term are getting 737 MAX deliveries in China. That's a huge market. I think it accounts for roughly 25% of the market as it is, and it's going to account for a pretty big part of the growth in the market. That's an emerging market with a lot of room to run. So 37 MAX really needs to get delivered there, and it looks like they've made some pretty good progress. 787, to my understanding, there's no new issues. It's getting their processes approved by the FAA. We were talking they were talking on the earnings call last quarter. They had some pretty tight deadlines for themselves, or at least markers at which investors could really hold folks accountable for them. They were talking about getting the 37 MAX delivered in China this quarter, and the 787 delivery resumptions in an April timeframe. That's pretty soon. So I think if they can get that, that's gonna really start easing the pressure on the cash side. And with that, I think they kind of need to walk a pretty tight rope here between delevering the balance sheet and investing in new products, because what they don't have is, and what's important, is a middle of the market aircraft to compete with the A321neo and the A321neo XLR. That's a really big market. If you look at the backlogs for Airbus, they're roughly equivalent for the A320 and the A321neos. So that's, you can't just cede that entire market to your competitor. So I think that's what they're going to need to do.
Yeah, great insight there. Thank you so much. We just have about 2 minutes left, and I'm going to challenge you to come into space just a little bit more. I know it's not your expertise, but you have a lot of insight from looking at these companies. Um, we talked about the ringing new stuff. How much do you hear people talking about the Starship Singularity that we heard about earlier today? Um, so, do people believe Elon Musk's projections of the change in launch costs? And you referenced earlier that the changes in launch costs had an impact in the past. Talk about the next phase of that from just sort of where you're sitting looking at these big primes.
So just to paraphrase your question, make sure I'm understanding correctly.
Although maybe it's not very intelligently asked, but
no. I'm just like just the projections of projections on launch costs. I guess I would say
and the hype around it. So not just projections, but also talk about your interpretation of how people feel about those projections.
okay. Yeah. So I guess I think it goes back to what we were talking about of just the big expense of putting something in space. And I would say that we've seen a lot of delivery on that cost reduction so far. Elon and others think that there's a lot more room to run from simply putting more launch products on putting more products on an individual launch. And that makes sense to me. I mean, I'm not an engineer, so I can't really speak too much into that. But I would imagine that you could put 50 different things on the same product. Yeah, I guess I would say that it's not unreasonable to expect continued reduction, and that's going to unlock more demand.
Yeah, great. Burkett, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, it's time for Saturday Space, where we look at things that we might enjoy on a Saturday in space: arts, sport, recreation, and entertainment. Today, our guest is James Vaughn. He was born in 1955. We don't get a lot of birthdays here, and grew up in an idyllic Ohio small town. His father was head of research for a major corporation, and his mother was an artist and poet. After studying history and politics, he gained a degree in photography and worked in a Chicago advertising industry for 3 decades. Now he's returned to his small town roots, where he maintains studio facilities and does illustrative work for clients around the world. I have been enjoying following his LinkedIn posts. James, welcome to Conversations for the Future.
Hey, Lee, thank you very much for the introduction. Are you getting me on video?
Yes, I am not seeing you. I'm seeing your screen.
Oh, okay. Well, here. It must be this little thing where
There
I'm
you
supposed to
are.
hit
Hi.
there. There we go.
Nice background.
Thank you. That's my studio back there. It's a nice view. Anyway, thank you very much for the nice introduction. And yes, I'm all about pictures and illustrations and artwork. This is a very important part of the space program in terms of inspiring people and informing people. Most of us won't really go to space.
Mhm.
So we need to see what's going on and see it in a manner which is going to be not only just technically informing, but also carrying some of the emotional impact.
Mhm.
It's a strange place. It's outer space, and I'm often confronted with the situation of really having to work hard to think about what it would really look like, or
Yeah.
feel like, or both. Pictures are not the real thing, whether they're a photograph, a video, or a painting. I would expect that if I was able to go up there or out there, it would be way beyond anything I ever imagined. Anyway, though, I would like to show just a short video of some of my work, if I can hit the right buttons here. So let's see. I'm ready to share screen. I think that's going to work. Let me hit share screen. Okay, and then let me do this again. Okay. Okay, so
We're seeing your desktop.
right.
Excuse me. Now we're seeing.
Oh, yes. I have to practice my buttons here. Oh, yes. My other bookmarks are missing. Okay, I'll just go over here and do it manually.
Yeah.
Yes, it's we've all become TV stars, right?
Haven't we?
And
Jazz hands.
it's a comedy of errors. There we go. Okay. Or as the guy who taught me about computers said, they're computers. What do you expect?
They only do what we tell them to do.
Yeah.
So far, anyway.
Okay, let's see here. This should be it. Are you getting this?
Yes.
Okay, that's a good sign. All right, let's try. Okay, let's see. I need it. I've got, okay, let's see. All right. I can't, I've got a menu from Zoom covering part of what I have to access on the side here with different people. Oh, let's see here. Hide thumbnail. Ah, there we go. The old hide thumbnail. Okay.
There we go. Looking good.
Getting the soundtrack.
No.
Are you getting the soundtrack on this?
No, but we're seeing the beautiful
Okay.
images.
Hold on a second here. Oh. Oh, there we go. Share sound. Haha. See, there's a special button there. Here we go. So that's some of what I do.
It's wonderful. And interestingly, we just had conversations about customers today. We're talking about investing. I noticed that so many of your images have corporate logos on them. Um,
Right.
let's get the nuts and bolts. Talk a little bit about your business, the customers that you've had over the years, how that market has changed and evolved.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay. Okay. So you want to know about the business? Okay. My father used to tell me I was a really bad businessman. I was a good artist, but a bad businessman. He was a very good businessman. And I've tried all, I'm beginning to understand some of the stuff he was trying to teach me. Now, first off, some of those images, the layouts are proposed layouts. They weren't necessarily ads that ran.
Yep.
And so selling space, selling the idea of space exploration, it has never really been that easy. It is easy for a certain amount of the population who's been enthusiastic, but even at the time of the landings on the moon and Apollo 11, the space program only enjoyed about a 50% solid support, and the other half of Americans were either skeptical or thought it was a waste of money.
Yeah.
So that's at the apex of the first golden age of the space program, and Neil Armstrong's putting his foot on the moon. So there's always going to be some people that don't care,
Yeah.
or they aren't interested, or whatever. And I'm concentrating mainly on trying to foster more enthusiasm from those that are already interested, as well as reaching out to those who really at this point are just not that well informed. If I walk around, I talk to normal people, and actually most people don't know we have a space station, and they don't know that there are 6 people up there. They're really surprised, sort of, that, and so there needs to be a much larger effort and a much more creative effort in selling the space program, in I hate to use the word selling, but communicating about space and about really how exciting it is and how cool it is, because that's sort of the basics. I mean, and we shouldn't apologize about that. I mean, there's nothing more awesome than being part of the universe. And I also have news for people. We are already in space. Okay.
Yeah.
We live in space. And we're just kind of poking around in our front yard a little bit right now. There's a whole universe out there, and one way or the other, we're eventually going to be going out there. And it's inevitable. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
Sort of.
in a very interesting artistic way, and very apropos.
I'll tell you that having engineers as my art director and boss is sometimes kind of interesting.
Yeah, that
but
was
it's
going to be
also
my
fun.
my next
It's
question
also
was going to
fun.
be about the creative process. So it sounds
Okay.
like you're just launching into that. So
Well, yeah. I think of what I do. My original training was in photojournalism,
yeah,
and so I still think about what I'm doing as storytelling, conveying more than technical data, conveying more about the meaning of what's going on, and this is modern mythology, basically.
yeah,
This is heroic stuff, and the people who are going out there are heroes, and they're the vanguard of humanity, and so I try to do that. My techniques are basically those of traditional classic painting, although I'm working in digital. I still follow the same basic techniques, and I try to put um, a feeling of adventure, romance, excitement, and most of all, is inspiration. You know, I want, because, yes, I think there needs to be more of that, and that government agencies and companies should understand that and utilize the huge tools of the internet, which is, you know, an amazing forum and stage for this sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'm not an artist, but perhaps I feel like you have a wonderful way with landscapes, even though they're not necessarily land, right?
Right.
These scapes.
Let me do a screen share real quick
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
And well, okay, let's, gosh and gollies. Oh, here. There. Oh, goodness. Okay. I don't know if I need that, so I better keep it. Yes, anyway, you're talking about landscapes, and that was
Yeah.
kind of the last thing that I expected I would be doing. And I have a consultant, a friend who's a bona fide fine artist and a college professor and all this sort of thing. And that's one of the first things he pointed out was, you're doing landscapes in a lot of these cases.
Yeah.
And it turns out to be true. And I'm trying to follow the kind of in the footsteps of what's called the Hudson River School of American Painters, who were absorbed in showing and sort of selling the new West of America as the new frontier and a new exciting, beautiful place. Now this is a Martian terraforming project where they're building sealing in a rift, a small canyon area, and this is a botanical roof with algae tanks where they're growing algae for oxygen, food, and raw materials. And let's see, we also have, well, here's a good example here. And this is a little bit of homage to 2001, but so yeah, I'm doing landscapes, which is weird.
Yeah, yeah. It's
I
wonderful.
I kind of didn't expect to be there. And you know, here is some of the, you know, the guys I'm basically, they were doing the same thing. These painters from the 1800s, they were showing a new world, a new land. And of course they didn't have photography. And that's another thing, is that a lot of what we can't actually see what's going on out there.
Yeah.
We can get some videos here and there, but not really something that doesn't really, we want to give the feel, we want to give the emotion.
Yeah.
And that's important.
Yeah, when you compare to what their goals were, you talked about fostering more enthusiasm from those who are interested. And I think
Exactly.
those Hudson School images are
Yeah.
doing the same thing, right? They're not trying to
Right.
appeal to somebody who's going to stay on their farm in
Yeah, right. Exactly. They're going to be,
England or
we're
whatever.
fine here in Pennsylvania, leave us alone.
Yeah,
And, you know, then there's the ne'er-do-wells and the adventurers and everybody else like we are,
yeah,
who want to go out there into the unknown. Yeah, and I also take a lot of, I've studied a lot of the early public relations and illustrations and newspaper articles and things like that about the early space program. That's one of the reasons I mentioned that I was born in 1955,
Ah,
because I have had I was incredibly lucky to be around during the beginning of the space program.
yeah.
And I've been an enthusiast all the way through. And I also remember what it was like when they had really big budgets. And, the budgets are, I don't know, 1/10 of what they used to be. And so I also am aware of how the techniques and the methods they used back then to explain what was very new stuff to the public.
Yeah.
That a lot of people really didn't even have basic understandings. And so, they did a very good job of getting support.
Yeah. So I want to look at the algae picture that you showed. I don't want to pull it up again, but just the algae image, Martian community. Um, do you tend to work on what you want to work on first and then sell it? Or is that a commissioned piece that came from someone else's imagination and you have to execute on that?
That's a good question. A lot of the work that you see, I do on my own.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been that way. When I was a photographer, way back when I was a fashion photographer in Chicago, and to a large extent, even before that, as a photojournalist, I was a freelance. I've always been a freelancer, and so there's a lot of work I do just to practice my chops, as they say.
Yeah.
You aren't going to become a great violinist if you only play when people give you money. And so I am always making art illustrations. Part of it is training myself,
Mm-hmm.
and every assignment I get is always something new to do. Something I have to, I've never. What does Mars look like? And blah blah blah. And so a large part of what I do is on my own, for my own fun and for everybody else's fun.
Yeah.
And then there's the commissioned work. What was the question about? You were saying something about when I'm working. Oh, what I choose to do is actually, the assigned work that I've been getting, the commercial illustration, commercial art work in this area has been the most creative, actually. And I've had the freest hand to do things the way I think they should be done, than ever before in the advertising and all the other stuff that I did before.
Yeah.
So that's actually turned out to be a fun surprise,
Oh, that's good.
even
Okay.
though I'm really having to go through a quick Reader's Digest version of engineering, aerospace mechanics, and orbital. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a fine line between that engineering and being able to draw it really well. You talked earlier about heroes and vanguards. And I've noticed in your work, and Rod's going to jump in and talk about Ad Astra a little bit here. I've noticed a lot of little girls featured in your work.
Yes.
Talk about that decision in context of the heroes comment and where you're headed with that.
Okay, let me go back to screen share for that. And I've always expected, little girls are a big part of who needs to be inspired and who are the scientists and who are the astronauts. I've always felt that way. And so I want to illustrate that and express it. And let's see, let me bring this up. I think
Yeah.
I'm not, yes, it's an important part of my vision. I can say that.
Yeah.
Okay, my favorite moment in my job of being an aerospace illustrator so far was this picture was sent to me by her dad.
Oh.
And this is a poster of one of my illustrations. And it really, you know, this is what, here's the original. This is why I'm doing it,
Yeah.
basically,
Yeah.
you know. That says it all.
A wonderful moment. Rod, if you want to unmute yourself and say a few words, it's always nice when we have friends on the program together.
Yes, is it the Rod?
Yes, it's the Rod. Hi, Jim.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Wouldn't
I
have
haven't-
missed this for the world. This is the first time I've actually seen you on video, so this is kind of exciting for me.
I like your background. That's pretty cool. Very Jules Verne.
You like that?
Yes.
So Jim and I have been working together for, I think, almost 7 years in one way or another.
Yeah.
And he's become the exclusive source of covers for Ad Astra, the magazine I edit. And occasionally I get questions about that from the people I work for. You know, why aren't you using somebody else? And there's lots of space artists out there, and come on and so forth. Jim, can you bring up, if you could screen share for a second, can you bring up the A-bomb picture?
Oh, okay.
Which,
Oh,
for reasons,
it's a hydrogen bomb. It's a
hydrogen bomb.
Right.
You know, when I saw this piece of work that Jim had done, and his portfolio, by the way, has, I think at last count, about 6,000 images that he's done. The man's the most prolific person I've ever seen in the arts. I saw this and I thought, you know, this is a masterpiece of storytelling. The whole thing's right there. You don't even need the text. I mean, it's good that it's there, but the tricycle next to the reentry warhead says it all. And I think this is something that's kind of specific to people that are not just fine artists, but who have also spent time in advertising, because you have a really unique sense, Jim, of how to tell a story. And sometimes it's just some very slight speed streaks that are emanating from one of your spacecraft, or it might be the color selection, or it might just be the orientation to the background or in free space or to a landscape. But all your illustrations, especially the ones we've used for covers, thank you for those, tell a story. And it's a multi-layered, multifaceted story that really draws people in. So I guess what I'm getting at is, you know, there are a lot of artists that can draw machines beautifully, you know, pictures, illustrations of the Saturn V flying or what have you.
Yeah.
But storytelling's tougher. And so right here, we get the full story of what this poor little rover, it's either Opportunity or Spirit, I think it's Opportunity as I recall, is up against. You know, here's a life-ending storm coming. And there's a lot of things at work here, and I won't try to go through them because I'm not the artist, but, you know, there is a whole bunch of elements here that tell us that story and give us, you know, you were talking about heroes earlier. This machine's a hero, and it's very clearly depicted here. So, you know, more in context of the sessions today, you really have a way of selling the subject that is unique. You've got some pictures, for instance, that you've done, illustrations you've done of warships and airplanes, many, that have an incredible amount of drama in them. And that's why a defense contractor wants them, right? Because it makes their product look heroic. So I'll just close on saying I've appreciated your work over the years, and we need to talk about the next cover very soon.
Okay. Thanks, Rod. Rod has been a big inspiration for me and a big help as I got going into this whole area of aerospace illustration.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Rod, for jumping on. I've enjoyed the covers as well. And Jim, I've so enjoyed and hope that you'll gain some additional followers on LinkedIn through this conversation. Really,
I hope
really
so.
appreciate your work.
Hire me. Yes, especially the big guys. It's been sort of a hard push to get into the larger organizations. I think probably because they have their own art departments.
Yep.
and freelancers are unusual these days.
Mhm.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today for Conversations for the Future. And tune in tomorrow for more discussions. Thank you so much.